There is an island in the South Pacific that most people have never heard of, and almost no one could find on a map without help. It is not a large island by any measure. It is not beautiful in any way that photographs can capture. It is covered in dense, suffocating jungle that traps heat like a closed fist, laced with rivers that carry disease, and ringed by shallow coastal waters that become graveyards for ships. The ground beneath its trees is dark and soft and holds its dead without ceremony. Birds call from canopies so thick that sunlight barely reaches the floor, and the air smells of rot and salt and rain that never fully stops. In the summer of 1942, roughly 20,000 young American men were sent to this island with orders to take it from one of the most disciplined and battle-hardened military forces on Earth. Most of them had never been in combat before. What followed was not a quick, decisive victory. It was not a clean story of strategy and precision. It was 6 months of grinding, suffocating, desperate fighting in conditions so brutal that the jungle itself became an adversary as dangerous as the enemy. It was a campaign fought on beaches and in mud, and through airless green walls of vegetation so dense that men could be separated from their unit by 20 feet and never find their way back. It was fought from the cockpits of fighter planes above a sea that reflected fire, and from the decks of ships that would be swallowed by that same sea before morning. It was fought by men who were hungry, sick, frightened, and exhausted, who held a line not because they were certain they would survive, but because holding it was the only thing that stood between total defeat and the chance of something better. This is the story of those men. This is the story of Guadalcanal. And if you are settling in for the night, if you have found this documentary at the end of a long day, and you are looking for something to carry you slowly towards sleep, something with enough weight and enough human truth to quiet the noise in your head, then you are in exactly the right place. Get comfortable. Let the story come to you. You do not need to hold every detail. Let the voices and the images and the long arc of this history wash over you. The men who lived this story did not sleep easily for a long time afterward. Perhaps that is reason enough to hear it and to carry it gently with you into the night. The island was called Guadalcanal. The Americans who fought there simply called it the Canal, and they said the name the way people say the name of a place that changed them, quietly, with a kind of weight behind the syllables. Before the war, it was almost entirely unknown to the outside world. A few thousand indigenous islanders called it home. A handful of colonial outposts and coconut plantations dotted its northern coast, established by British and Australian trading interests who found the island difficult and the climate punishing even in peacetime. There were no roads to speak of. There was no infrastructure. There was nothing on Guadalcanal that anyone had ever considered worth fighting over. Then Japan entered the war, and the mathematics of the Pacific changed entirely. Japan's expansion across the Pacific in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 was extraordinary in its speed and reach. Singapore fell, the Philippines fell, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, all fell. A Japanese empire that had been building for decades extended itself with sudden and overwhelming force across an ocean that American planners had assumed would be contested slowly and at great cost to the attacker. It was not. The Japanese moved fast. They fought with ferocity, and they won. By the middle of 1942, Japan controlled a defensive arc stretching across much of the central and southwestern Pacific. And somewhere along the northern coast of Guadalcanal, Japanese construction crews had cleared jungle and flattened earth and begun building something that could not be allowed to exist, an airfield. An airfield on Guadalcanal meant Japanese fighter cover extending deep into the South Pacific. It meant Japanese bombers within range of Allied supply lines to Australia. It meant the entire Allied position in the region, painstakingly and expensively maintained, could be strangled from the sky. The airfield was not finished when American reconnaissance aircraft photographed it. That gave someone in Washington a narrow window, perhaps the only window there would ever be, to act. And so the decision was made. The Marines would go in. The operation had a code name that captured almost nothing of what it would actually become. It was called Watchtower, and the men assigned to it called it something else almost immediately, Operation Shoestring, because that was what it was. Launched ahead of schedule, with inadequate supplies, insufficient naval support, and planning that had been compressed into weeks rather than months, Watchtower was a gamble of almost reckless proportions. The commanders who ordered it knew the risks. The Marines who loaded onto transport ships in late July of 1942 and sailed north toward an island most of them had never heard of, they sensed the risks too, even if the full picture was not shown to them. They went anyway. There is something in that fact worth sitting with for a moment. Not the heroism of it, which is real but often overstated in the retelling. Not the patriotism, which was genuine but complicated. Something simpler and more human than either of those things. These were young men, many of them barely into their 20s, some younger, who had been handed rifles and told to cross an ocean and take an island away from an enemy that had not yet lost. They had been trained as well as time allowed. They had been told the plan, and when the ships moved and the coastline disappeared and there was nothing around them but open water, they sat with their equipment and their uncertainty and their unspoken fear, and they went forward. That is what this documentary is about. Not strategy, though we will cover strategy. Not politics, though decisions made in Washington and Tokyo shaped every moment of this campaign. This documentary is about the experience of that island, what it felt like to arrive there, to hold ground there, to endure there, and for some, to die there. It is about the Marines on the perimeter in the dark, listening to sounds in the jungle they could not identify. It is about the pilots who took off from a damaged airfield into skies full of enemy aircraft and came back changed, or did not come back at all. It is about the sailors in the waters offshore, fighting a parallel war that was every bit as brutal as the one on the ground. And it is about an island that became, over 6 months of fighting, one of the most significant places in American military history. Not because it was planned to be, but because so many people bled and died to hold it. If you have found this documentary through a search, or through a quiet night of scrolling, or because someone who cares about history pointed you toward it, welcome. If you are here for the first time, consider settling in for the whole story, all 18 chapters of it. There is a lot of ground to cover, and none of it should be rushed. And if you choose to let this story carry you into sleep tonight, know that you will be resting while the history of ordinary people doing extraordinary things moves around you in the dark. There are worse ways to spend a night. The island is waiting. The ships are moving. The year is 1942. Let us begin. There is a particular kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of the world holding its breath before something irreversible tears through it. On the 7th of December 1941, that silence broke over the Hawaiian island of Oahu in a way that no American alive that morning would ever forget. The sun had barely cleared the Kualau Range when the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept in low over the calm blue water of Pearl Harbor, carrying with them not just bombs and torpedoes, but the end of an era. Within 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet lay battered and burning in the shallow mud of the harbor. Battleships that had seemed immovable sat listing and shattered, their crews trapped below decks or scattered across oil-slicked water. Across the country, radios crackled with the news, and a nation that had spent years arguing about whether to enter the war found the argument settled for it in the most brutal way imaginable. The shock was total and immediate, but beneath the shock ran something else, something colder and harder and more durable. Americans had been hurt badly, and hurt in a way they had never been hurt before, on their own soil, on their own bases, against their own men who had been eating breakfast and writing letters home when the bombs started falling. Within a day, the United States was at war, not just against Japan, but against the full weight of the Axis powers. Congress voted for war, with a swiftness that reflected not deliberation but rage. Men lined up outside recruiting offices before the ink was dry on the declaration, many of them barely old enough to shave, and the machinery of the most powerful industrial nation on earth began, slowly at first and then with gathering fury, to turn itself toward war. The isolationism that had kept America on the sidelines since the 1930s did not simply fade, it was incinerated, replaced overnight by a collective will to fight that would sustain the country through 4 more years of suffering. But even as that will hardened, the situation in the Pacific grew darker by the week. Japan had not struck Pearl Harbor in isolation. The attack was part of a coordinated sweep across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that had been planned with meticulous care and executed with speed that left Allied forces reeling. Within days of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces were moving against the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Japanese Navy moved through the Pacific like a tide that knew no shore it could not reach. Allied naval forces, already weakened and spread thin, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned in engagement after engagement. The old assumptions about Western military superiority in Asia evaporated in the face of an enemy that had studied modern warfare carefully and had no intention of fighting on anyone else's terms. The fall of Hong Kong came before the year was out. Malaya fell with stunning speed, and with it went Singapore, the great British fortress at the southern tip of the Malayan Peninsula that had been considered impregnable and proved to be anything but. The Dutch East Indies followed, and then Burma, and then the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur fought a desperate defensive campaign before being pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula and ultimately forced into surrender in the spring of 1942. The Bataan Death March that followed became one of the defining atrocities of the Pacific War, burning itself into American consciousness as proof of what defeat meant in this particular conflict. These were not abstract geopolitical losses. These were catastrophes, each one carrying thousands of lives with it into captivity or death. By the middle of 1942, Japan had established a defensive perimeter of almost incomprehensible scale. It stretched from the Kurile Islands in the north, down through the central Pacific, across the island chains of the southwest Pacific, and through Southeast Asia, all the way to Burma and the borders of British India. Inside that perimeter, Japanese engineers and construction battalions were building airfields, fortifications, naval bases, and supply depots on dozens of islands across the Pacific. The strategy was clear enough in its logic: create a ring of fortified positions so extensive and so mutually supporting that any American counteroffensive would be ground to pieces before it could gain purchase. Japan's military planners believed that the cost in American lives of assaulting that perimeter would eventually exceed what the American public was willing to pay, and that a negotiated peace would follow. They had studied American politics carefully and concluded that American democracy, with its aversion to prolonged and costly wars, would seek an exit before paying the full price of total victory. What those planners had perhaps not fully accounted for was Pearl Harbor itself. The nature of the attack, unannounced and without a formal declaration of war delivered in advance, had produced exactly the opposite of the psychological effect Japan needed. Rather than inducing war wariness, it had produced a hardness of purpose that would prove extraordinarily difficult to erode. American military and political leadership understood that they were now in a war that would require years of sustained effort and would demand things of the American people and the American military that neither had ever been asked to provide before. The question was not whether to fight. The question was how, and where, and with what. In Washington and in the command centers of the Pacific, military planners wrestled with the geography of their predicament. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly a third of the Earth's surface. Fighting a war across it meant fighting a war against distance itself, against the sheer physical impossibility of projecting force across thousands of kilometers of open water, against fortified positions on islands held by an enemy who would not yield them without fighting to the last man. Traditional land warfare doctrine was nearly useless in this environment. There were no continuous front lines, no flanking maneuvers through open country, no clear axis of advance that could be seized and exploited in the way that armies had been fighting for centuries in Europe. The Pacific War would require something different. It would require the ability to cross open ocean, to put men ashore on hostile beaches under fire, to seize and hold islands far from any established base, and to do all of this repeatedly, island after island, across a chain of battles that would extend for years and thousands of kilometers. The doctrine that answered these requirements had a name: amphibious assault. The idea was not new. Military forces had been landing troops from the sea since the earliest days of organized warfare. But the scale and sophistication of what the Pacific War demanded was genuinely unprecedented. Landing tens of thousands of men on defended beaches, supported by naval gunfire and air cover, sustaining them with supplies across open ocean, and then doing it again and again as the offensive advanced. This was a form of warfare that the United States had never been called upon to execute at anything approaching the required scale. The lessons of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, where Allied forces had been cut to pieces on the beaches of the Dardanelles, hung heavily over every planning session. The margin for error was essentially zero. Get it wrong, and men would die by the thousands in the surf without ever reaching the shore. The branch of the American military that had thought hardest about these problems, that had spent the interwar years developing and refining amphibious doctrine while everyone else was focused elsewhere, was the United States Marine Corps. The Marines had a long history as a naval infantry force, trained and equipped to operate from ships and to project force ashore. Through the 1920s and 30s, Marine officers had developed what they called the Fleet Marine Force concept, building a body of doctrine for amphibious operations that addressed everything from the design of landing craft to the coordination of naval gunfire support, to the logistics of sustaining a force that had no rear area beyond the ocean. Much of this doctrine had never been tested in actual combat at scale. Some of it would prove wrong in ways that would cost lives, but the thinking had been done, and the thinking mattered, because when the Pacific War demanded an amphibious force capable of seizing fortified island positions, the Marines were the closest thing America had to one. The months immediately following Pearl Harbor were consumed by a form of strategic triage, American and Allied forces had to stabilize a situation that was deteriorating on multiple fronts simultaneously, while also beginning the enormous task of mobilizing for a prolonged offensive war. Decisions had to be made about priorities: Europe or the Pacific, defense or offense, and with what forces and at what risk. The answers to those questions would take months to emerge fully, and they would be shaped by events as much as by deliberate planning. But even in the darkest weeks of early 1942, when Japanese forces seemed capable of going anywhere and taking anything, certain things were becoming clear to the men responsible for turning the tide. The defensive phase could not last forever. At some point, the United States and its allies would have to strike back, not merely to hold what remained, but to begin the long, brutal process of rolling back Japanese gains, island by island, airfield by airfield, across the width of the Pacific Ocean. That process would begin sooner than most expected, and it would begin in a place that almost no one in America had ever heard of: a large, thickly jungled island in the lower Solomon Islands chain, situated in the southwestern Pacific, roughly 800 kilometers north of the Australian territory of New Guinea. An island where Japanese construction battalions were, even as American planners debated strategy in Washington, laying the foundations of an airfield that would give Japan the ability to interdict Allied supply lines to Australia. An island where malaria moved through the jungle as freely as the wind, where the heat and humidity were weapons in their own right, and where the first test of American amphibious doctrine against a fully prepared and determined enemy was about to take place. Its name was Guadalcanal, and it would become the beginning of everything. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Marine Corps existed in a particular kind of institutional limbo. It was respected in certain quarters, quietly dismissed in others, and fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone who had not served in its ranks. The Corps had fought in the jungles of Nicaragua and the streets of Shanghai, had bled on the beaches of France in the First World War, and had spent the interwar decades refining a radical concept that most military thinkers considered either visionary or suicidal, depending on their temperament. That concept was amphibious assault, the art of throwing men from ships onto defended shores and expecting them to survive long enough to fight their way inland. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Marine Corps numbered fewer than 70,000 men total. What the coming months would demand was something closer to a national mobilization disguised as a single branch of service. The machine, as it was, had to be built almost from nothing, and it had to be built fast. The expansion that followed was not simply a matter of signing enlistment papers and issuing rifles. Building a fighting force capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of open ocean required a fundamental rethinking of how men were trained, how units were organized, and how the sprawling problem of putting soldiers on enemy beaches was to be solved in practice rather than theory. Marine recruiters flooded cities and towns across the country, drawing in young men from farms and factories and college campuses who had never fired a weapon in anger and had no particular reason to volunteer for the branch most likely to find itself swimming toward a beach under fire. Yet they came, in numbers that staggered even optimistic planners. Boot camps that had processed hundreds of recruits a year were suddenly processing thousands a month. Drill instructors worked through the night and into the grey dawn, compressing months of preparation into weeks, accepting that the luxury of time was gone and would not return. Training was a deliberate act of controlled suffering. Marine doctrine at the time held, with a conviction bordering on religious faith, that men who had been pushed past the point of physical collapse in training could be trusted not to collapse when the enemy was doing the pushing. Recruits ran through obstacle courses carrying equipment that weighed nearly as much as they did, waded through swamps at 2 in the morning, and performed bayonet drills until the motion became involuntary. The rationale was not cruelty for its own sake, though some instructors were temperamentally suited to cruelty regardless of rationale. The rationale was the recognition that nothing in peacetime could fully simulate combat, but the closer training came to breaking a man, the better his chances when something real tried to break him. Men who had never sweated through a southern summer learned what heat and exhaustion did to judgment and reflex. Men who had never gone 2 days without sleep learned what the third day felt like. None of it was sufficient preparation. All of it was necessary. The amphibious doctrine that would carry Marines across the Pacific had been developing since the early 1930s, shaped by a series of war games, exercises, and theoretical studies that produced, among other documents, a manual that would become one of the most consequential military publications of the 20th century. That manual laid out the fundamental principles of amphibious assault in meticulous detail: how ships should approach a coast, how landing craft should be organized into waves, how air support should be coordinated with naval gunfire, and how infantry units should transition from the chaos of the beach to coherent inland advance. What the manual could not fully account for was the gap between theory and the specific, grinding reality of putting thousands of men ashore under fire. That gap would be filled, painfully, by experience. The landing craft themselves were a story of improvisation and institutional stubbornness colliding with practical necessity. Early designs were awkward, slow, and mechanically unreliable, and military traditionalists who remained skeptical of the entire amphibious concept were quick to point this out. What changed the equation was the eventual adoption and refinement of vessels specifically designed to carry troops from open water to beach, run the bow onto the sand, drop a ramp, and allow men to pour out under whatever the enemy chose to throw at them. These craft were not elegant, they were not comfortable, they were loud and prone to mechanical failure, and sat low enough in the water that a moderate sea could drench every man aboard before he ever reached the beach. But they worked, and working was the only standard that mattered. Leadership in the expanding corps was a complicated and sometimes contentious business. Seniority and political connections had shaped promotion in the pre-war years, as they did in any peacetime military, and the sudden pressure of war produced the usual tension between men who had climbed the ranks through longevity and men who had ideas. Some senior commanders understood instinctively what the Pacific would demand: a willingness to accept uncertainty, to make decisions without complete information, to push men hard while keeping their trust. Others carried assumptions forged in earlier conflicts that would prove dangerously outdated. The process of sorting one kind of commander from the other was ongoing, messy, and conducted largely at the expense of the men being led. Among those who would shape the coming campaign was a cadre of officers who had spent the interwar years thinking seriously about amphibious warfare, reading the historical record of operations where men had tried and failed to storm defended shores, and drawing the right lessons from those failures. They understood that speed was the central fact of any beach assault, that the time spent between the moment a landing craft touched sand and the moment its passengers were off the beach and moving inland was the most dangerous time any Marine would ever experience. They drilled this understanding into the men under their command with a persistence that some found excessive and that combat would eventually justify entirely. Speed, keep moving, the beach is where you die if you stop. By mid-1942, the 1st Marine Division had been formed and was training in the continental United States before shipping out to the Pacific. It was a division assembled from men at varying stages of readiness, welded together by a training regime that had to account for everything from basic rifle marksmanship to the intricate coordination of battalion-level operations. Younger enlisted men trained alongside veterans who had served in small colonial operations years earlier, and who carried an institutional knowledge that no training manual could fully replicate. The veterans passed on what they knew: how to read terrain, how to move through jungle without telegraphing position, how to stay calm when everything was loud and confusing and the correct action was genuinely unclear. The younger men absorbed what they could and filled in the rest with the particular recklessness of the very young. Equipment shortfalls haunted the expansion throughout. The country's industrial base was shifting from peacetime production to war production, but that shift took time, and the men training for Pacific warfare often trained with weapons and gear that were already considered obsolete, or with substitutes for equipment that had not yet arrived. Units drilled with wooden mock-ups in place of weapons that were still on production lines. Amphibious training exercises were conducted with landing craft borrowed from other commands, used on a schedule that allowed each unit only a fraction of the rehearsal time doctrine recommended. Commanders improvised, adapted, and made do, because making do was the only available option. The alternative was to wait until everything was ready, and waiting was a form of defeat. The Pacific itself was barely understood by most of the men who would fight across it. Intelligence on Japanese positions was fragmentary and often outdated, and maps of island chains that would soon become household names were either non-existent in usable form or wildly inaccurate in their details. Officers who had served in the Philippines or the pre-war Asiatic station had some contextual knowledge of tropical operations, but even that knowledge had limits. The jungle environments of the Solomon Islands were different in character from anything most American military experience had encountered. Denser, wetter, more immediately hostile to human health, and far harder to navigate than the training grounds of the American South. Disease was not a secondary concern to be addressed after the main tactical problems were solved. Disease was a tactical problem in its own right, one that would kill and incapacitate men as surely as enemy fire. What the building of this machine ultimately required, beyond training and equipment and doctrine, was a particular quality of institutional will, a conviction that the task was possible even when the evidence for that conviction was thin. The Marine Corps had survived budget cuts and institutional skepticism, and the condescension of army planners who considered amphibious operations a minor specialty of limited strategic relevance. It had survived by insisting, through decades of relative obscurity, that it was building towards something specific and necessary. By 1942, that insistence had to be converted into reality under time pressure that left almost no margin for error. The men who would carry rifles onto the beaches of Guadalcanal were the product of that conversion, imperfectly prepared, unevenly equipped, led by commanders of sharply varying quality, and facing conditions that no amount of training had fully anticipated. They were, for all of that, what the country had, and what the country had would have to be enough. By the spring of 1942, Japan had achieved something that few military powers in modern history could claim: the near-total domination of an entire ocean. Across a sweep of territory that stretched from the frozen Aleutian Islands in the north to the steaming jungles of New Guinea in the south, the flag of the Imperial Japanese Navy flew over ports, airstrips, and garrison towns that had been, only months before, under the control of Western colonial powers. The speed of this expansion was not accidental. It was the product of years of meticulous planning, rigorous military preparation, and a strategic vision that understood the Pacific not as a barrier, but as a highway, one that Japan intended to control entirely. American planners staring at maps in Washington and Pearl Harbor were confronted with a picture that was, by any honest assessment, alarming. The enemy had not merely advanced, the enemy had flooded outward in every direction at once, and the flood was still moving. The logic behind Japanese expansion was coldly rational. Tokyo understood that a prolonged war against the industrial might of the United States was, in the long run, a war Japan could not win. The strategy was therefore to seize as much territory as quickly as possible, establish a fortified outer defensive perimeter so vast and so costly to penetrate that American public opinion would eventually demand a negotiated settlement rather than a grinding island-by-island reconquest. Every island in that perimeter was intended to serve a function. Some held natural resources, oil, rubber, bauxite, that Japan needed to sustain her war machine. Others held deep-water harbors that could shelter naval fleets. Still others were nothing more than platforms of coral and jungle earth, valuable only because an airstrip could be carved from them and a garrison installed to defend it. The cumulative effect was a defensive web that the Japanese military called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, though the men garrisoning its outermost edges in sweltering tropical heat would have used rather different language to describe their situation. The Solomon Islands sat at the southeastern edge of this expanding perimeter, curving down from the larger land masses of New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago like the tail of a scorpion. They were, geographically speaking, an unlikely place to anchor a strategic contest. The islands were remote, poorly mapped, sparsely populated, and covered in some of the most inhospitable jungle terrain on the planet. Thick canopy forest draped over volcanic ridgelines, malarial swamps occupied every low-lying coastal fringe, and the waters between the islands concealed reefs and shoals that confounded even experienced navigators. The local population of Melanesian islanders had lived there for centuries, largely untouched by the outside world, and the few Western traders and missionaries who had established themselves there had done so with considerable effort and modest success. Yet by mid-1942, this remote chain of islands had become one of the most strategically significant pieces of real estate in the entire Pacific War. Japanese planners understood the Solomons with a clarity that the Allies were only beginning to match. Control of the island chain meant control of the sea lanes connecting Australia to the United States. If Japan could project air power from airfields in the Solomons, she could threaten Allied shipping across a vast arc of ocean, potentially severing the supply lines that kept Australia in the fight, and preventing American forces from using the continent as a staging ground for any future offensive. The garrison at Rabaul, the major Japanese base on the island of New Britain to the northwest, had already become one of the most powerful military installations in the southern Pacific. From Rabaul, Japanese aircraft could range hundreds of kilometers in every direction, and Japanese naval forces could sortie at will into the waters between the island chains. The Solomons were the logical next step, a series of stepping stones leading southeast, each one extending Japan's reach just a little further toward the Allied heartland. It was in this context that Guadalcanal began to attract serious attention from Japanese military engineers. The island was large by the standards of the Solomons, roughly 150 kilometers from end to end, rising steeply from its north coast through jungle-covered ridges to central peaks that caught the clouds and wrung rain from them almost every afternoon. It was not, in any conventional sense, a pleasant place. The jungle interior was nearly impenetrable. The coastal lowlands were brackish and mosquito-infested, and the climate alternated between a crushing tropical heat and violent rainstorms that turned every dirt track into a river. But on the north coast, there was something that Japanese engineers recognized immediately as irreplaceable: a broad, relatively flat coastal plain with firm enough ground, away from the worst of the swamp, to support the construction of an airfield. That plain, and what could be built on it, was worth more than any natural harbor or mineral deposit the island might offer. Japanese construction teams arrived in the early months of 1942 and began work immediately. The project was ambitious: clearing jungle, grading earth, laying the foundations of a runway long enough and firm enough to accommodate combat aircraft. This was not a small undertaking in conditions where the humidity rotted timber and rust consumed iron almost overnight. Hundreds of laborers, many of them conscripted from other parts of Japan's occupied territories, worked alongside Japanese army engineers to push the project forward. Progress was steady, if not rapid. By the middle of 1942, the runway was taking shape, the outline of an operational airfield emerging from what had been, only months before, unbroken coastal forest. Supply ships arrived regularly, bringing additional construction equipment, aviation fuel, and the infrastructure necessary to transform the site from a cleared strip of earth into a functioning forward airbase. The intention was clear. When finished, the Guadalcanal airfield would allow Japanese aircraft to operate far to the south and east, extending the defensive perimeter and placing Allied shipping routes under direct threat. American intelligence did not immediately understand the significance of what was being built on Guadalcanal. In the chaos of the first months after Pearl Harbor, with Japanese offensives rolling forward simultaneously in multiple theaters, it was difficult for Allied analysts to distinguish between what was strategically critical and what was merely the routine expansion of an already sprawling occupying force. Coast watchers, a small and extraordinarily brave network of Allied observers operating behind Japanese lines on various Pacific islands, began reporting unusual activity in the Solomons. These men, many of them former colonial administrators and plantation managers who knew the islands intimately, lived in the jungle with small radios, watching ship movements and troop deployments and transmitting what they saw to Allied headquarters. Their reports were fragmentary but consistent. Something significant was happening on Guadalcanal's north coast, and it involved construction equipment, supply ships, and large numbers of workers. Aerial reconnaissance filled in more of the picture. Flying boats and land-based patrol aircraft, operating at the extreme limits of their range from Allied bases to the south, made tentative passes over the Solomons and returned with photographs that analysts scrutinized carefully. The images were imperfect. Cloud cover was frequent. The aircraft were operating at altitudes that limited resolution, and the interpreters were working with limited reference data on what Japanese military construction typically looked like from altitude. But the evidence accumulated steadily, and by early July of 1942, Allied headquarters had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The Japanese were not merely fortifying the Solomons in a general sense. They were building an operational airfield on Guadalcanal, and they were building it fast. Once complete, it would change the strategic balance of the entire southern Pacific in Japan's favor. The reaction in Allied command was immediate and, in some quarters, close to panic. Australia, already anxious about the possibility of Japanese invasion, pressed hard for action. American naval and ground commanders, still absorbing the implications of earlier battles at sea, understood that the window for intervention was narrow. Every week that passed allowed the Japanese to pour more concrete, grade more runway, and install more defenses. Every week made a future assault more costly and more dangerous. The mathematics were unforgiving. An airfield under construction was vulnerable. An airfield with operational fighter cover was a fortress. If Allied forces were going to act, they had to act before the airfield became functional, before Japanese aircraft began flying regular patrols from Guadalcanal's north coast, before the defensive perimeter hardened into something that would take years and tens of thousands of lives to breach. What Allied planners were assembling in those tense summer weeks was not merely a military operation. It was a response to a fundamental challenge about who would control the future of the Pacific. Japan had moved first, moved fast, and moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and that confidence was not entirely misplaced. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had, in the months since Pearl Harbor, defeated every significant Allied force sent against them. British, Dutch, and American units had all been swept aside with a speed that shocked observers around the world. The Japanese soldier had acquired, in Allied minds, a reputation for ferocity, endurance, and tactical sophistication that made any confrontation with him seem daunting. That reputation was not propaganda. It was grounded in painful recent experience, and every Allied officer planning an operation against Japanese-held territory had to reckon honestly with it. And yet the airfield on Guadalcanal's north coast represented something beyond a military installation. It represented a choice point, a place where the trajectory of the entire Pacific War could be altered, if Allied forces were willing to accept the risks that intervention would demand. The island itself was almost unknown to the men who would soon be ordered to fight on it. Most of the Marines preparing for amphibious operations in mid-1942 could not have found Guadalcanal on a map without help. The name meant nothing to them, carried no historical weight, evoked no image beyond the vague and threatening idea of distant jungle. Within months, it would carry a weight that no one who had not been there could fully understand, a name that would be spoken quietly for decades afterward by men who had survived it, and not spoken at all by those who had not. By the spring of 1942, the men who ran America's war understood something with cold clarity. The Pacific was bleeding. Every week that passed without a major American offensive was a week in which Japanese engineers drove pilings, laid runways, and strung wire across another island. Every week of inaction was a gift handed to an enemy that was still moving, still building, still hardening a defensive arc that stretched from Burma to the Central Pacific like a chain forged in iron. The question facing American military planners was not whether to strike back. The question was where and when and with what. Washington in the spring and early summer of 1942 was a city of competing urgencies. The war in Europe demanded attention, resources, and men. Britain was calling for support. The Soviet Union was fighting for its life on the Eastern Front. And yet the Pacific theater had its own internal logic, its own rhythms of danger that could not be ignored. Admirals and generals gathered around maps and argued late into the night, tracing the Solomon Islands chain with their fingers, calculating distances, assessing risks, and weighing the near impossible against the merely very difficult. The debate was not academic. Every day of delay had a price that could be measured in concrete and steel somewhere deep in the South Pacific. The intelligence picture, when it finally came into focus, pointed toward one particular stretch of jungle and grass, Guadalcanal. It was a large island in the lower Solomon chain, roughly 90 miles long and about 25 miles wide, blanketed in dense tropical rainforest and cut by rivers that ran brown with sediment. It had no significant civilian population to speak of, no great harbour, no famous harbour. What it did have, as reconnaissance aircraft confirmed in the early summer of 1942, was an airfield under active construction. Japanese engineers and their labour battalions were clearing jungle, and flattening ground at a place the locals called Lunga Point. When finished, that airfield would be capable of basing Japanese aircraft that could reach deep into the Allied supply routes connecting the United States to Australia. It would give Japan a hammer to swing at the very lifeline holding the Allied Pacific effort together. American planners looked at that unfinished runway and understood immediately it could not be allowed to open for business. The man most responsible for turning the intelligence picture into an operational plan was Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, who commanded Allied naval forces in the South Pacific from his headquarters in New Zealand. Gormley received the directive to plan an offensive against Guadalcanal with something less than enthusiasm. He understood better than almost anyone the logistical realities of the situation. The distances involved were staggering. American naval forces in the region were still rebuilding from the losses at Pearl Harbor, and the Marines who would be asked to land on the island had never conducted a large-scale amphibious assault in combat conditions. Gormley's reservations were serious and professionally reasoned, but the order came from above, and above meant all the way to the top. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, was the driving force behind the decision to go offensive. King was not a man who tolerated delay gracefully. He had watched Japanese expansion continue across the Pacific with a fury that was sometimes difficult for his subordinates to manage, and he was absolutely determined that the United States would not spend the whole of 1942 on its back foot. King believed that a limited offensive operation in the Solomons would accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. It would contest Japanese air power in the region. It would give the Marines a combat test under conditions that, while dangerous, were at least theoretically manageable. And it would signal to Tokyo that the Americans had no intention of waiting for Japan to come to them. The operation received its code name, Watchtower. Among the men who would carry the weight of Watchtower on the ground, none carried more than Major General Alexander Vandergrift, the commander of the 1st Marine Division. Vandergrift learned in late June of 1942 that his division had been selected to make the assault. The news arrived ahead of schedule. Vandergrift had been told, not long before, that his division would have until early 1943 to finish training and prepare for offensive operations. Now he was being told the landing would happen in early August, a matter of weeks away. By any reasonable standard, the division was not fully ready. Equipment was still arriving. Training exercises were incomplete. Supply inventories were thin. Vandergrift raised these concerns through proper channels and was told, in essence, that the schedule would not change. The plan as it developed called for the 1st Marine Division to land on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, near the Japanese airfield construction site, and seize the airfield within the first day or two of the operation. Simultaneously, a separate landing would be made on the smaller islands of Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, just across the water from Guadalcanal's northern shore, where Japanese forces had established a seaplane base and garrison. Naval gunfire and air support would cover the landings. Transports would rush supplies ashore as quickly as possible. The plan looked coherent on paper. What it could not fully account for was the chaos that combat always introduces into even the most carefully drawn diagram. The logistical picture was, at best, troubling. The transports that would carry the Marines were not fully loaded. Some had been loaded without regard to the combat sequence of unloading, meaning supplies were stacked in an order optimized for shipping efficiency rather than tactical need. Certain categories of ammunition, food, and medical supplies were in shorter supply than planners would have liked. Naval escort forces available for the operation were formidable, but not unlimited, and no one could guarantee how long the Navy would be able to keep its ships in the waters around Guadalcanal while Japanese aircraft and submarines were active in the region. The Marines would be going in with what they had, and the hope was that it would be enough. What the planners could not control, and could only estimate, was the Japanese response. Intelligence suggested that Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal itself were not numerous, perhaps a few thousand, many of them construction laborers rather than combat troops. But Japanese air forces, based at Rabaul, on the large island of New Britain several hundred miles to the northwest, were powerful and battle-experienced. Japanese naval forces in the region could respond with surface ships capable of devastating an American fleet caught at night in the confined waters of what would come to be called Iron Bottom Sound. The Solomons were deep in Japanese-controlled territory, and the nearest major American base was more than 1,000 miles away. Every American ship that sailed into those waters was sailing into a place where the enemy had significant advantages. And yet the decision held. It held because the alternative, allowing Japan to complete the Guadalcanal airfield unopposed, was judged to be worse than the risks of an imperfect, undersupplied, and somewhat premature assault. It held because King's will was iron, and his logic, however uncomfortable, was sound. It held because somewhere in the calculus of commanders who understood the long war ahead, the cost of action seemed manageable against the cost of continued inaction. Watchtower was not a plan that inspired universal confidence. Officers who reviewed it used words like inadequate and underprepared in private communications that were filed away and not publicized. One flag officer, in a phrase that would attach itself to the operation and follow it through history, called it Operation Shoestring. Shoestring it may have been, but the decision was made, the orders were written, and the Marines of the 1st Division began to receive their final briefings in late July of 1942. They were told what the objective was. They were told why it mattered. Some of them were shown aerial photographs of the half-built runway at Lunga Point, and they were asked to understand that a strip of graded jungle earth was worth crossing an ocean to fight for. Most of them, soldiers in the way that all good soldiers are, accepted the mission with the particular combination of professionalism and resignation that characterizes men who have been trained to do hard things and have been told that a hard thing must now be done. The transports were loaded. The escort ships took their positions. The fleet began to gather in the waters of the South Pacific, drawing together from dispersed anchorages like parts of a machine assembling itself for a single purpose. Somewhere ahead of them, separated by more than 1,000 miles of open ocean and covered by the moist, indifferent green of the equatorial rainforest, the Japanese engineers at Lunga Point continued their work, unaware that the decision had been made, that the men were coming, and that everything was about to change. They came from ports scattered across the South Pacific, assembling in ones and twos until the sea itself seemed crowded. Transport ships, destroyers, cruisers and carriers gathered into formation through the final days of July 1942, moving with the careful deliberateness of men who understood the weight of what they were carrying. Nearly 20,000 Marines were embarked across dozens of vessels, packed into sleeping quarters never designed for comfort, breathing recycled air heavy with the smell of fuel oil and sweat, and the particular anxiety that fills any space when men know they are going to war. The fleet was large by any measure the Marines had ever seen assembled under one flag, yet against the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific, it seemed almost fragile, a thin line of steel threading its way toward an island that most of the men aboard could not have located on a map 6 months earlier. Orders had come down with the urgency of something that cannot be delayed, and so the voyage had begun before anyone had truly finished preparing. That was perhaps the most honest truth of the whole enterprise. No one would ever be finished preparing for what lay ahead. Aboard the transports, a man learned very quickly how to read the mood of the ship. Senior sergeants moved through the holds with the practiced calm of men who had learned that panic is contagious and that steadiness is the first discipline a leader owes his soldiers. Junior Marines, many of them barely out of training camps in the continental United States, watched those sergeants the way a child watches a parent in a thunderstorm, measuring their fear against someone else's apparent composure. Letters had been written and posted before embarkation, and now there were no more letters to write, no more goodbyes to arrange. The world behind them had already begun to recede, and the world ahead had not yet taken on enough shape to think about clearly. In that space between departure and arrival, men occupied themselves with the only tools available to them: habit, routine, and the company of the men beside them. Equipment was checked with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual. A Marine going over his rifle for the 4th time in a single afternoon was not doing it because he believed it had changed since the 3rd inspection. He was doing it because the act of checking gave his hands something to do while his mind tried to settle. Ammunition was counted and recounted. Packs were loaded, tested, adjusted, and loaded again. Officers spread maps across any flat surface they could find, reviewing terrain they had studied in briefings but which none of them had actually seen. The island called Guadalcanal was a long, mountainous mass of jungle and coastal plain, larger than most of the men had expected, and the maps showed rivers, ridgelines, and a Japanese airfield construction site whose exact state of completion remained uncertain. There were gaps in the intelligence, and everyone at every level of command knew it. The mission was to land, seize the airfield, and hold it. Beyond that, the details grew increasingly speculative the further one looked into the future. The fleet's route had been plotted to avoid known Japanese patrol zones, swinging wide through stretches of ocean where the chance of detection was thought to be lower. The Navy maintained radio silence as the formation moved north and west, no signal going out, no broadcast breaking the electromagnetic quiet that the operations planners hoped would serve as their best camouflage. Radar watches were stood in rotating shifts. Lookouts scanned the horizon without pause. Every man who understood the nature of the Pacific War knew that Japanese air and naval forces had been operating across this region for months without serious challenge, and that the fleet now crossing these waters was doing so with the knowledge that discovery could mean catastrophe before a single Marine set foot on a beach. The silence was therefore not merely a precaution, it was an act of collective discipline, thousands of men holding their breath together across hundreds of nautical miles of open sea. Sleep came unevenly and without real rest. The equatorial heat pressed down through the metal decks of the transports, and below the waterline, the compartments where most of the enlisted Marines were berthed were loud with the sound of engines and the creaking of the hull and the ceaseless movement of the sea. Men lay in their hammocks or on narrow bunks and stared upward and thought about the things men always think about in the hours before they cannot think freely anymore. Home, family, the particular smell of a place they would not see again for a long time, if ever. Some men slept deeply, a gift of youth or exhaustion or simple temperament. Others lay awake until the middle watches of the night, listening to the breathing of the men around them and feeling the ship move beneath them, like a living thing carrying them somewhere they had not chosen to go and could not choose to leave. Food aboard the transports was serviceable rather than good. The galleys produced meals in volume, and a Marine who had spent any time in the field had already learned to treat food as fuel rather than pleasure. But the act of eating together, the lines, the noise, The conversation over metal trays served a purpose beyond nutrition. It was a social mechanism, a way of maintaining the texture of ordinary life inside a situation that was anything but ordinary. Men talked about baseball and hometowns and complained about the food with exactly the same vocabulary they would have used at any training camp. And this too was a form of preparation, a way of insisting that they were still themselves, still the people they had been before the fleet departed, still connected to a life that made sense. Chaplains moved through the ships. Officers held informal briefings that were as much about managing information as delivering it. Experienced NCOs, men who had been in uniform long enough to have learned the difference between what you said to keep men steady and what you actually believed, sat with young Marines and answered questions with the measured confidence of people who understood that honesty, carefully parceled, is more useful than either false comfort or unfiltered fear. Some of those NCOs had served in places that seemed impossibly distant from the Pacific: Haiti, Nicaragua, China, campaigns that the wider American public had barely noticed and that bore almost no tactical resemblance to what was coming. Still, they had been in combat, and in the currency of a transport ship crossing toward battle, that experience was worth more than any briefing document. The Japanese forces defending Guadalcanal remained, in the minds of the men aboard the transports, an almost abstract threat. The Imperial Japanese Army had a reputation that the previous 8 months had done nothing to diminish. Since December of the year before, Japanese forces had moved through Southeast Asia and the Pacific with a speed and aggression that had left Allied commanders repeatedly off balance. Fortified positions that military planners had expected to hold for months had fallen in days. Ships had been sunk, aircraft destroyed on the ground, armies surrendered in humiliating numbers. The Marines crossing toward Guadalcanal knew this history because it was recent enough to feel personal, and because any honest accounting of the Pacific War up to the summer of 1942 had to begin with the acknowledgement that the enemy was formidable and had not yet lost. There was no single dominant emotion among the men on those ships. That is one of the things that organized armies understand imperfectly, even when they try to understand it well, that 20,000 men are 20,000 separate interior lives, each processing the same situation through filters shaped by different histories, different characters, different levels of experience with fear and hardship and violence. Some men were genuinely eager for combat, in the way that men who have trained hard for a thing can become impatient for the test of it. Others were frightened in ways they would not have admitted aloud and would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Most were somewhere in the middle, resolved, cautious, capable, uncertain, which is perhaps the most honest description of what courage looks like before it is tested. As the fleet drew closer to the Solomon Islands chain, the mood aboard the transports shifted in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to miss. The talking became quieter. The routines that had occupied the first days of the voyage continued, but with less distraction in them, men checking equipment not to pass time now, but because the time for simply passing time was running out. Officers who had kept a deliberate distance from the full weight of the operation during the crossing found that distance contracting as the navigation charts showed fewer and fewer miles remaining. The sea looked different this far north, or perhaps it only seemed that way, darker, less familiar, charged with a significance that the men projecting it onto the water knew was their own minds working, but could not dismiss. Radio silence held. The fleet moved. The island was out there somewhere ahead of them in the dark, covered in jungle, threaded with rivers, occupied by an enemy who did not yet know they were coming. In the holds of the transport ships, men settled into whatever quiet they could find and waited for morning with the collective patience of people who have no other option. They were nearly 20,000 strong, drawn from a corps that had been expanding and training toward exactly this kind of moment, carrying weapons and equipment and a doctrine built for fighting on beaches and through jungles, sailing toward a campaign that none of the doctrine had fully anticipated. The island had a name. They knew it now, had been saying it for days, though it still sounded foreign in their mouths. A word from another language laid over a piece of ground none of them had ever walked. Before very much longer, they would know it the way you only come to know a place through suffering, completely, permanently, and without any desire to return. The fleet moved through the night like a held breath. Dozens of ships, transports, destroyers, cruisers, and the heavier vessels of the fire support group cut through the waters of the South Pacific without running lights, without radio transmissions, without any signal that might betray their presence to the enemy or to the few coast watchers who might not yet have passed word through the right channels. The darkness was not merely a tactical convenience. It was, for every man standing watch on those rolling decks, a kind of mercy. It kept the scale of what they were attempting from being fully visible. If you could not see the length of the convoy stretching behind you across the black water, you could almost pretend this was just another exercise, just another rehearsal for a war that had not yet turned into something you could smell and hear and bleed from. But the men knew. They had always known. The smell of oil and salt and the particular tension in the shoulders of every officer on every bridge told them this was real. This was the morning they had been training toward, and it was almost upon them. The island itself appeared first as a shape, darker than the dark around it. Guadalcanal rises from the sea with a certain defiance, its central mountain spine catching cloud and rain even on clear days. Its coastline a ragged alternation of beach and mangrove and jungle growth so dense it looks impenetrable from the water. The men aboard the transports who pressed close to the railings in the pre-dawn hours would have seen almost nothing at first, just that looming silhouette against a sky that had not yet begun to lighten. It was roughly 60 kilometers long and perhaps 30 kilometers wide at its broadest point. A landmass that seemed, from a distance, neither impressive nor obviously threatening. But distance was the only frame in which Guadalcanal looked manageable. Every man who would eventually set foot on its soil would come to understand that the island's apparent passivity was a form of deception all its own. The pre-dawn hours of the 7th of August, 1942, carried a low, overcast and poor visibility, conditions the American planners had hoped for and which the weather, unpredictably, delivered. The overcast would not last. It rarely did in this part of the Pacific, where the sky had a habit of clearing at the worst possible moments, but for the hours of final approach, it gave the fleet a kind of cover that no amount of careful planning could have guaranteed. Lookouts on the Japanese shore positions and the partially completed facilities near the airfield construction site had no reason, in those final dark hours, to be scanning the horizon for a fleet. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was not expecting an invasion. Their defensive posture was oriented toward the long term, toward completing the airfield, toward establishing a position from which they could project air power across a wide radius of ocean. An American amphibious assault on this scale, this far into territory Japan considered its own, was not yet a contingency they had prepared for with any urgency. Then came the guns. Naval gunfire support is not a subtle instrument. When the fire support ships opened up in the early light of the 7th, targeting Japanese positions, construction facilities, and the area around the airfield, the concussion of the heavy guns rolled across the water and into the jungle with a force that registered not just as sound, but as physical pressure, a wave of displaced air that arrived before the noise and announced what was coming. The ships worked in coordinated patterns, Their fire meant to suppress, to destroy, to force defenders away from the beaches and into confusion before the landing craft began their runs. Watchers on the transport ships could see the flashes of the guns and then, seconds later, the plumes of smoke and earth rising from the island's tree line where the rounds struck. It was, in the most literal sense, the opening voice of the campaign, and every Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal could hear it. The Japanese garrison was not large. American reconnaissance flights and intelligence gathered over the weeks preceding the operation had established, with reasonable confidence, that the forces actually present on Guadalcanal were fewer than original estimates had suggested. The construction workers and engineers who formed much of the Japanese presence near the airfield were not trained combat infantry, and the military personnel directly assigned to the island amounted to a force that, while capable of defending a fixed position, was not equipped for a prolonged battle against a full Marine division coming ashore in strength. This intelligence was important, but it came with caveats. Numbers in the jungle are never as reliable as numbers on a planning map. What reconnaissance could not easily reveal was where those forces were positioned, how quickly they could concentrate, and what additional troops might be called in from elsewhere in the Solomon Islands chain once the alarm was raised. And the alarm was raised within minutes of the bombardment beginning. There is a particular kind of institutional shock that runs through a military unit when it realizes, not abstractly, but concretely, and with explosions as punctuation, that it has been found and that an enemy is coming. Japanese command on Guadalcanal and in the broader regional headquarters further north began receiving reports almost immediately. Signals went out, officers were roused, decisions about how to respond, whether to defend the beaches, fall back into the jungle, or concentrate forces around the airfield, had to be made quickly, with incomplete information, under the psychological weight of artillery falling somewhere uncomfortably close. The Japanese on Guadalcanal that morning were not paralyzed. They were trained soldiers, but they were caught at the worst possible moment of a military operation, not yet finished building their position, not yet fully reinforced, and now suddenly required to fight a battle they had not expected to fight on this timetable. For the Marines packed into the transport ships, watching the bombardment from the rails, the noise and fire of the naval guns carried a complicated emotional charge. There was relief in it. The guns were doing something. The long anticipation was breaking into action, and there was also a sharp and honest awareness that the return would come. Japanese aircraft from bases further north in the Solomons would be dispatched as soon as the news arrived. Japanese naval vessels might already be moving. The bombardment was a declaration, and declarations invite responses. The element of complete strategic surprise, which some of the bolder pre-operation estimates had hoped might be achievable, had been surrendered the moment the first shell left the first gun barrel. What remained was the question of timing. Could enough men and enough equipment get ashore, and could enough ground be seized before the Japanese response arrived in force? The fleet's positioning off the north coast of Guadalcanal placed the landing forces in waters that would become, in the weeks and months ahead, among the most contested stretches of ocean in the entire Pacific War. The channel between Guadalcanal and the islands to the northwest would eventually accumulate such a weight of sunken ships from both navies that sailors would come to call it a name that carried no irony: Iron Bottom Sound. On the morning of the 7th of August, that name had not yet been earned. The water was dark and choppy, the fleet was intact, and the landing craft were being prepared for their first runs toward the beach. Everything that would make that channel infamous lay ahead. For now it was simply the water between the ships and the island was where the Marines had to go. reconnaissance reports coming through to commanders during the approach, and the early bombardment confirmed that the airfield construction site appeared to be the most significant Japanese asset on the island, and that it was held, for the moment, by a force that should not be able to stop a determined landing. But "should not" is a phrase that military history treats with consistent unkindness, and the commanders who read those reports understood the difference between an assessment and a guarantee. The jungle on either side of the airfield could conceal almost anything. The northern coast offered beaches broad enough for landing operations, but the jungle began almost immediately beyond the tree line, and jungle swallowed defenders and attackers alike with equal indifference to their plans. Every officer who studied the maps that morning knew that the maps and the actual ground would disagree with each other in ways that would only become apparent when men were moving through the undergrowth with rifles and the weight of everything they needed to survive. As the eastern sky began to lighten and the bombardment continued its work, the landing craft were lowered and the first waves of Marines began their descent down the nets toward the water. The noise was immense and continuous. Gun smoke drifted across the water, mixing with the morning mist that the rising sun had not yet burned away. Above the fleet, aircraft from the supporting carriers flew combat air patrols, watching for the Japanese aircraft response that everyone knew was coming and whose timing no one could predict. The island sat there in the growing light, its mountains disappearing into cloud, its beaches white and apparently empty, the smoke rising from the bombardment's impact points marking it with the signs of a war that had just, decisively, arrived. Guadalcanal was no longer a construction site on a Japanese map. It was a battlefield, and the men dropping toward the water in their crowded landing craft were the ones who would have to prove, in the most direct way possible, what that meant. The morning of the 7th of August had not yet finished becoming itself. What it was becoming, every man on the water already understood, would not be over for a very long time. The dawn of August 7th, 1942, broke over Guadalcanal with a pale light that filtered through the smoke and haze of the naval bombardment. The Japanese defenders, scattered and disoriented by hours of punishing shell fire from American cruisers and destroyers, had been driven to ground across the island, their communication networks disrupted, and their command structure fractured by the sheer violence of the opening assault. What the Marines did not yet understand was that the majority of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were not positioned near the beaches where the Americans were landing. Instead, they were scattered in defensive garrisons and construction camps further inland and at the southern end of the island, a geographical fact that would shape the entire character of the first day's fighting. The beach landings, therefore, would unfold under conditions that seemed almost miraculous compared to what planners had feared. The American troops would come ashore against minimal organized resistance, allowing the operation to proceed with a speed and efficiency that surprised even the commanders who had calculated every detail of the assault. This unexpected advantage, however, would prove temporary. As the morning progressed and Japanese officers began to comprehend the scale of the invasion and organize their scattered units, the nature of the fighting would shift dramatically from a beach assault to a campaign of rapid maneuver and increasingly vicious counterattack. The first waves of Marines hit the beaches north of Lunga Point in the pre-dawn hours, their landing craft grinding onto the black volcanic sand as machine gun fire, sporadic and poorly coordinated, rattled across the shoreline. The beach defenses that the Japanese had constructed proved inadequate and hastily prepared. Many of the gun positions had been damaged by the preliminary bombardment, and the American destroyers and cruisers had done their work well, silencing or suppressing the most dangerous installations before the Marines ever set foot on sand. Boats disgorged their human cargo in organized waves, and thousands of Marines began pouring onto the beach, their rifles held high, their equipment heavy on their shoulders, their eyes sweeping the palm trees and jungle beyond the beach for signs of organized enemy fire. The first soldiers to land encountered scattered rifle shots and bursts of machine gun fire, but nothing resembling a coordinated defensive line. Japanese troops, many of whom had been asleep or scattered across the island when the bombardment began, had not yet assembled into effective fighting positions. Officers shouted orders, sergeants herded groups of men inland, and the Marines established a foothold on Guadalcanal, with a speed that owed everything to the enemy's disorganization and the sheer weight of American firepower concentrated on the landing beaches. Supply troops began moving ashore, dumping crates of ammunition and provisions onto the sand, and within the first hour, more than 5,000 Marines had established themselves on Guadalcanal without suffering catastrophic losses, a stunning success by the standards of amphibious warfare. But the relative quiet of the landing beaches masked a more complex struggle unfolding deeper inland, where Japanese officers were rapidly organizing their scattered troops for counterattack. The Marines did not pause to consolidate their beachhead. Instead, following their tactical doctrine and the urgent demands of their commanders, they pushed rapidly inland toward the Japanese airfield, which was the true objective of the entire operation. The coconut plantations that dominated the interior of northern Guadalcanal became the first significant terrain feature that the advancing Marines encountered, and these groves, with their orderly rows of trees and relatively open forest floor, allowed for rapid movement while still providing cover and concealment for ambush. Patrols of American troops pushed deeper into this landscape, encountering isolated Japanese defenders who had been left behind to fight delay actions. Small groups of soldiers who had not yet received orders to retreat or were determined to make a stand against the American advance. The first casualties of the Guadalcanal campaign occurred in these coconut groves, where Marines and Japanese soldiers met at close quarters, where rifles cracked and grenades detonated, and where American troops got their first real taste of combat against an enemy that, though disorganized on a larger scale, remained fiercely determined to resist. Officers and sergeants pushed their men forward, understanding that speed was the greatest asset they possessed. Every hour gained before Japanese forces could organize meant fewer coordinated counterattacks, fewer opportunities for the enemy to concentrate superior numbers against the American advance. The Japanese command structure on Guadalcanal, meanwhile, was struggling to comprehend what had happened and to respond with organized counterattack. The commanding officer of Japanese forces on the island, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was on Rabaul at the time of the invasion, and communication between the scattered garrisons and higher command was slow and uncertain. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, who commanded the largest organized Japanese force on Guadalcanal, roughly 2,400 men of the Ichiki detachment, began receiving fragmentary reports throughout the morning that American forces had landed in significant numbers and were advancing inland. Unlike many of the younger, more impetuous Japanese commanders who would later wage suicidal attacks against Marine positions, Ichiki understood military tradition and the doctrine of aggressive response. In his mind, delay meant defeat, and defeat meant dishonor. He began concentrating his forces and planning a counterattack for that same evening, convinced that a swift and violent response could still drive the Americans back into the sea before they could establish a permanent foothold on the island. Japanese soldiers, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda asserting the superiority of Japanese martial spirit and the weakness of American soldiers, were told that an invasion force had landed and that they would move immediately to crush it and send the Americans fleeing. Many Japanese troops received this news with confidence bordering on arrogance. They did not yet comprehend that they were facing an enemy whose numbers, firepower, and logistical support far exceeded anything they had encountered before. The Marine advance inland continued throughout the morning and early afternoon, with companies and battalions pushing toward the Japanese airfield through increasingly dense jungle and terrain that grew more difficult as the troops moved away from the coastal plantations. The airfield itself, partially completed by Japanese engineers, represented the true prize of Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled it would control air access to the entire region, and every senior commander on both sides understood this basic strategic reality. The Marines, advancing without major organized resistance, but harassed by scattered Japanese positions and delayed by difficult terrain, nonetheless moved with impressive speed, their officers keeping the men pressing forward rather than allowing them to consolidate positions prematurely. Supply troops struggled to keep pace with the advancing combat units, creating the first of what would become chronic supply difficulties for the American forces on the island. The jungle itself became an antagonist, almost equal in significance to the Japanese defenders. The heat was suffocating, the vegetation was dense and difficult to navigate, and insects and other tropical pests attacked the Marines continuously, creating a form of attrition that would persist throughout the entire campaign, regardless of the level of combat intensity. By late afternoon, Marine scouts had reached the airfield area and reported that it was lightly held, with only scattered Japanese defenders present and no sign of organized defenses. The discovery was almost shocking in its implications. The main Japanese garrison, it became clear, was not defending the airfield but was positioned elsewhere on the island, probably at the southern end and in scattered camps around the interior. This meant that the American operation had achieved something even better than expected. Not only were they ashore in significant numbers without catastrophic casualties, but they could consolidate control of the airfield, the objective that would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome, without fighting a major engagement for it. Marine officers immediately moved to occupy the airfield, to fortify it against the Japanese counterattack that everyone understood was coming, and to begin the work of repairing the Japanese construction to prepare it for American use. The implications were staggering. With the airfield in American hands, the balance of power on and around Guadalcanal would shift dramatically once American aircraft could operate from it. Japanese air superiority, which had seemed assured in the opening hours of the operation, would evaporate as Marine and Army fighters began flying combat missions from this captured strip. As darkness fell across Guadalcanal on August 7th, the strategic situation had been transformed in the space of a single day. The Marines had established a secure beachhead, had advanced inland more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and had seized control of the most strategically significant piece of real estate on the island without fighting a pitched battle for it. Thousands of American troops were now firmly established on Guadalcanal, and reinforcements were being landed throughout the day at a steady pace, building up American strength and making it increasingly unlikely that any Japanese counterattack could throw the Americans back into the sea. The cost had been notably light compared to what commanders had feared. American casualties on August 7th were fewer than 100 killed and several hundred wounded, a loss rate that seemed almost impossible given that they had just launched an amphibious invasion into enemy territory thousands of miles from American bases. The surprise had worked. The coordination of the naval bombardment and the air cover had been effective, and the Marines had moved with aggression and efficiency that had paid dividends throughout the day. But this success, remarkable as it was, concealed a more precarious situation than the casualty figures suggested. The Japanese, despite their initial disorganization, were already rallying and preparing for counterattack. Japanese officers were concentrating their forces, Japanese aircraft were being prepared for operations against the American fleet in the waters off Guadalcanal, and Japanese naval forces were being mobilized to attempt reinforcement and resupply of their garrisons. The Marines on the island, despite their beachhead and their possession of the airfield, were still isolated and vulnerable to attack. Their supply lines were long and subject to Japanese air and naval attack, and their defensive perimeter, while established, was still being organized and fortified. The events of August 7th represented an American victory in the tactical sense, but they were merely the opening move in what would become a months-long campaign of grinding attrition and desperate combat. The Japanese had not been defeated or even decisively repulsed. They had merely been pushed back and forced to respond. As night fell and the Marines began improving their positions and standing watch for the inevitable counterattack, both sides understood that the true battle for Guadalcanal was only beginning. Throughout the evening of August 7th, scattered Japanese counterattacks struck the marine perimeter as isolated groups of enemy soldiers, either left behind or cut off from their main forces, attempted to dislodge the Americans from their beachhead. These attacks were uncoordinated and relatively small in scale, crushed quickly by Marine defenders who had prepared hasty defensive positions and who maintained discipline under fire. Each repulsed attack inflicted losses on the Japanese and demonstrated to the Marines that their enemy was willing to fight and die rather than retreat. The Japanese soldiers showed no inclination to surrender or to withdraw, and each encounter reinforced the understanding that the coming campaign would be bloody and that American victory could not be taken for granted. The Marines, inspired by their successful landing and their rapid advance inland, fought with increasing confidence, but they remained alert to the possibility of larger and more organized attacks. Officers and senior enlisted Marines moved continuously along the perimeter, checking positions, encouraging troops, ensuring that ammunition was distributed, and that each defensive position had clear fields of fire and adequate support from neighboring units. The jungle outside the perimeter became a place of danger and mystery. Japanese soldiers might be hiding anywhere, and every night would bring the possibility of attack, ambush, and close-quarters combat with an enemy who fought with a ferocity that many American soldiers were encountering for the first time. The supply situation, which would become a chronic problem throughout the campaign, was already becoming evident by evening on August 7th. The landing craft had delivered tons of supplies and ammunition, but not nearly the quantities that would be needed to sustain a prolonged campaign, and the Navy's ability to resupply the Marines depended entirely on the ability of American naval forces to protect the transport ships from Japanese air and naval attack. The thought of being cut off or starved of supplies was beginning to preoccupy commanders even as they celebrated the successful landing. The beachhead was secure for now, but its future depended on maintaining communication with the rear and keeping the supply lines open against Japanese efforts to sever them. This awareness created a sense of urgency in every Marine on the island. The landing was not the culmination of the operation, but merely its beginning, and the real work, holding the island against Japanese counterattack, defending the airfield against repeated assault, and maintaining supply and reinforcement in the face of enemy opposition, lay ahead. Every man understood, or quickly came to understand, that Guadalcanal would be a test of American courage, American logistics, and American perseverance in a way that no previous marine operation had been. The first day on Guadalcanal had been a remarkable success by the standards of amphibious warfare. The Marines had landed in strength, had advanced inland without suffering devastating casualties, and had seized the strategic objective that would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome. But that success was fragile and conditional, dependent on the Marines maintaining their positions against Japanese counterattack, on American naval forces protecting the beachhead and supply lines, and on American aircraft arriving to operate from the captured airfield before Japanese air power could interdict supply and reinforcement. The Japanese, despite their disorganization and their failure to repel the landing, had not been defeated. They remained a significant force on the island. They were determined to retake the airfield and drive the Americans back into the sea, and they would now begin using every weapon and every tactic available to them to achieve that objective. The campaign for Guadalcanal, in many ways, truly began on the evening of August 7th, when the Marines looked out into the darkness beyond their perimeter and understood that months of fighting, disease, hunger, and desperate combat lay ahead. The rapid victory of the first day had created the preconditions for a much longer and more brutal struggle, one that would test the Marines in ways that nothing in their training or previous experience could have prepared them for. As the morning sun broke over Guadalcanal on that 8th of August 1942, the Marines who had scrambled ashore in the pre-dawn hours found themselves advancing inland with a strange mixture of urgency and bewilderment. The beaches, which commanders had feared would be a charnel house of American bodies, had instead proven almost eerily quiet. Japanese defensive fire had been sporadic and ineffective, suggesting that the enemy either lacked sufficient troops to mount a serious beach defense or had positioned their main forces elsewhere on the island. This unexpected fortune came at a cost, however, for it meant the Marines could not yet be certain how many soldiers they truly faced or where those soldiers had concentrated their strength. Officers shouted orders to maintain formation and momentum, understanding that the longer their forces remained scattered across the beach and coastal plantations, the more vulnerable they would be to coordinated counterattacks. The vegetation grew denser as the Marines moved away from the shoreline, and the tropical heat began to sap strength from men already exhausted by hours in landing craft and the tension of anticipating combat. The jungle itself became an adversary, thick and suffocating, offering concealment to hidden enemies and disorienting to troops trained in European-style warfare with clear sight lines and defined terrain. Yet the Marines pushed forward, driven by officers who understood that their orders were explicit and their objective clear: reach and secure the Japanese airfield before the enemy could organize an effective response. The airfield itself lay roughly in the center-northern portion of the island, a sprawling complex of coral and crushed rock that the Japanese had been constructing for months in preparation for their air defense strategy throughout the Solomon Islands region. Intelligence officers attached to the Marine Command had briefed officers on what to expect: a partially completed installation with taxiways and a main runway, surrounded by Japanese base structures, fuel storage areas, and perhaps light defensive fortifications. What those briefings could not convey was the sheer scale of the undertaking, or the sense of almost surreal abandonment that the Marines would encounter when they finally reached it in the early afternoon. As the first Marine patrols emerged from the coastal vegetation and coconut plantations, they encountered Japanese soldiers scattered across the airfield complex, but their numbers were far smaller than any plausible estimate had suggested. Japanese troops who had been working on construction and maintenance scattered at the appearance of armed Americans, some firing from fixed positions before withdrawing into the jungle beyond the airfield perimeter, others abandoning equipment and supplies as they fled. The fact that the airfield was not heavily defended struck the American commanders with the force of revelation, for it suggested that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were distributed across the island in garrison positions rather than concentrated in a single defensive line. This meant opportunity, but it also meant uncertainty. If the Japanese could not defend their own airfield, where had they positioned their main strength? And would they not surely attempt to retake it once they fully understood what had happened? The airfield that the Marines now occupied was an incomplete work, a monument to Japanese ambition and American good fortune. The main runway stretched across the landscape, surfaced with coral and crushed rock rather than finished concrete, useful for Japanese aircraft, but temporary in character and still requiring significant additional work. Taxiways branched off from the main runway in carefully planned patterns, and scattered across the complex were fuel storage facilities, maintenance hangars in various stages of completion, and structures intended to house personnel and equipment. Japanese workers and soldiers had abandoned their tools and half-finished projects with such haste that the Marines found vehicles still containing supplies, fuel drums standing ready for use, and workshops with equipment still inside. The scale of Japanese logistical effort was evident everywhere the Marines looked. The airfield was not merely a runway, but a complete airbase, designed to support multiple squadrons of aircraft and the infrastructure necessary to conduct sustained air operations across the region. For the Marine Command, this was the prize they had come for, the strategic jewel that would transform the tactical situation in the Solomon Islands and, by extension, the entire Pacific War. An airfield deep in enemy territory, relatively undamaged and partially complete, offered the possibility of American air superiority in a region where the Japanese had previously ruled the skies unchallenged. However, every officer also understood that this prize would be fiercely contested. The Japanese would not concede air superiority in their own defensive territory without a struggle, and they would surely commit whatever forces they could assemble to retake the airfield before American aircraft could establish themselves there. Marines throughout the airfield complex immediately began the work of fortification and preparation, understanding that their respite would be brief. Engineers and support troops moved methodically across the landscape, marking out defensive positions, identifying terrain that offered advantages for machine gun placement, and beginning the task of constructing trenches and firing positions that would allow them to repel infantry assaults. The runway itself became a work site, with Marines and engineers setting about the enormous task of clearing it, repairing damaged sections, and preparing it for American aircraft operations, though the arrival of such aircraft remained uncertain. Other parties scoured the Japanese structures for useful equipment and supplies, cataloguing what the enemy had left behind and determining what could be integrated into American defensive efforts. Ammunition was distributed and carefully rationed, despite the initial abundance of captured Japanese stocks. For supplies from the homeland remained uncertain, and no one could predict how long the Marines would need to defend the airfield before American reinforcements and proper supply lines could be established. Medical personnel set up field hospitals in captured Japanese structures, converting enemy buildings to American purposes with a kind of practical efficiency that characterized the Marine response to every aspect of the captured complex. Officers established command posts and communication centers, attempting to coordinate defense against an expected Japanese counterattack, while simultaneously managing the continuous arrival of additional Marine units moving inland from the beaches. The work proceeded with focused intensity, each man understanding that the hours immediately following the capture of the airfield were critical. Speed and efficiency in fortification could mean the difference between survival and catastrophic defeat when the Japanese mounted their inevitable response. The Japanese command structure on Guadalcanal was in considerable disarray during these crucial hours, a condition that unknowingly worked to American advantage. Japanese forces on the island were distributed among several garrisons and construction parties, with the main body of troops stationed at the island's western end and in the region south and east of the airfield. Communication between scattered units was uncertain, and the Japanese commander in the region faced the immediate problem of ascertaining the full scope of the American invasion and determining the most effective response. Reports from Japanese soldiers who had fled the airfield area painted a picture of enormous American force, though the actual strength of the Marine landing force remained unclear. Japanese Army and Navy commanders worked at cross purposes, with Navy units nominally responsible for the airfield and Army units responsible for overall island defense, a division of responsibility that had never been clarified or properly coordinated. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, was en route to Guadalcanal with reinforcements, but his arrival would not occur for several days, leaving the immediate command structure in doubt and response options limited. In the absence of clear coordination from above, Japanese unit commanders began gathering whatever forces they could assemble for immediate counterattacks. But the sheer surprise of the American invasion and the speed with which Marines had advanced inland meant that no coordinated response could be mounted on the day of landing itself. This window of opportunity, lasting mere hours, would prove decisive in allowing the Americans to consolidate their positions around the airfield before facing the coordinated Japanese response that would come with nightfall and the following days. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the airfield on that first day, the perimeter around Henderson Field began to take shape, though it remained far from complete or fully secure. Marine officers worked to establish a coherent defensive line connecting key terrain features and taking advantage of the airfield's location and the jungle growth that surrounded it. The perimeter was not yet continuous, and there remained gaps and weak points where Japanese forces might potentially penetrate if they mounted a determined assault. However, the speed with which the Marines had established control over the airfield and its immediate surroundings gave them a crucial advantage in preparing for the battles to come. They were not defending against an organized enemy in prepared positions, but rather organizing their own defense against attacks that would come from scattered enemy forces, coordinating their response. Artillery pieces captured from the Japanese were examined and tested, and American artillery units moved into position around the perimeter, their guns creating fields of fire that covered the most likely approach routes for enemy counterattacks. The jungle that surrounded the airfield complex, while offering concealment and difficulty for any defender, also provided cover for Japanese forces attempting to approach the perimeter, a factor that every Marine officer understood would complicate their defense in the nights and days ahead. Despite these concerns, the mood among the American troops on the evening of the 8th of August was cautiously optimistic. They had accomplished the primary objective of their landing. They had control of the strategic prize for which the entire operation had been mounted, and they had done so at a cost far lower than commanders had feared. That optimism would prove premature, for the Marines remained isolated deep in enemy territory, far from adequate supply and reinforcement, and the Japanese had demonstrated no intention of surrendering the island or abandoning their strategic position without the most desperate struggle. The arrival of darkness brought with it a fundamental shift in the tactical situation that the Marines would come to know well in the nights ahead. Japanese forces began probing attacks against the Marine perimeter, testing its strength and identifying weak points that could be exploited in larger assaults. Small groups of enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle, attacking isolated positions and attempting to penetrate the defensive line at multiple points, probing to determine the extent of American fortifications and the concentration of American firepower. Marine machine gunners responded to these attacks with long bursts of fire, revealing the positions of their weapons and allowing Japanese forces to map the defensive layout of the perimeter. Night fighting in the jungle was chaotic and confusing, with visibility measured in meters and friendly fire a constant danger to Marines in close proximity to one another. The sounds of combat echoed across the airfield complex, the sharp cracks of rifles mixing with the heavier thunder of machine guns and occasional detonations of grenades or mortar fire. Each attack was repelled, and each night's fighting provided both the Marines and the Japanese with valuable information about their enemy's capabilities and tactical approaches. Yet each attack also exacted casualties. Marines died in the darkness, and Japanese soldiers fell against the Marine positions, and both sides understood that the probing attacks of the 8th and 9th of August were merely the prelude to more serious Japanese efforts to retake the airfield. The Marines, despite their exhaustion and the strain of the long days fighting, moved between positions, checking defenses, checking weapons, and preparing themselves for the larger battles that Japanese command would surely launch once the enemy had gathered sufficient forces and organized a coordinated response. In the days immediately following the initial landing, the strategic reality of the American situation became clearer as the shock of invasion wore off and systematic analysis of the tactical position became possible. The Marines controlled the airfield and its immediate surroundings, but this control extended barely more than a few kilometers in any direction, and Japanese garrisons remained scattered across the island at several points, particularly in the western and southern regions. Supply lines remained desperately uncertain. The American fleet that had delivered the Marines was already withdrawing, having suffered losses to Japanese air and naval counterattacks, and the promise of sustained supply and reinforcement was unclear. The Marines would need to subsist on what they had brought ashore and what they could capture from the Japanese until regular supply convoys could be established, a prospect that seemed increasingly uncertain as Japanese air and naval forces continued to contest American presence in the waters off Guadalcanal. However, the airfield itself represented a strategic asset of such magnitude that holding it, regardless of supply difficulties and enemy pressure, became the paramount objective. Every officer understood that once American aircraft could operate from Henderson Field, the balance of power in the region would begin to shift decisively in favor of the United States. Japanese air bases in the northern Solomon Islands and at Rabaul could be reached and attacked by American fighters and bombers operating from Guadalcanal. Japanese ships attempting to supply or reinforce their garrisons on the island could be attacked from the air, and American control of the airspace would effectively isolate Japanese forces on Guadalcanal from outside support and reinforcement. The airfield was thus not merely a tactical advantage but a strategic hinge point upon which the entire campaign would turn, and the Japanese understood this with the same clarity that the American commanders did. The immediate days following the 8th of August saw continuous and frantic activity around Henderson Field as the Marines worked simultaneously to improve their defenses, repair and enhance the airfield itself, and conduct patrols and reconnaissance to determine the location and strength of Japanese forces remaining on the island. The heat and humidity were relentless. Marines who had trained in temperate zones found themselves working in conditions of suffocating tropical intensity that drained strength and energy with terrifying speed. Insects swarmed across the island, adding to the misery and beginning to transmit the diseases that would eventually plague the American forces on Guadalcanal: malaria, dysentery, and various jungle fevers that would disable soldiers with equal efficiency to enemy bullets. Despite these hardships, the Marines pressed forward with their work, understanding that every hour they spent fortifying the airfield and improving its facilities was an hour well spent, for it moved them closer to the moment when American aircraft could operate from the field and when their isolation and vulnerability would begin to be addressed. Japanese patrols continued to probe the marine perimeter nightly, and larger raids were mounted as Japanese commanders attempted to gather sufficient force to launch a meaningful counteroffensive. The Marines, for their part, pushed reconnaissance patrols out from the perimeter to establish the positions of Japanese garrisons and to interdict enemy movement toward the airfield. These patrols occasionally encountered significant Japanese forces and returned to the perimeter with wounded and with information about enemy dispositions. Every piece of intelligence was analyzed by the command staff, and estimates of Japanese strength on the island began to take shape, though uncertainty remained about the exact scope of enemy forces and their intentions. The psychological weight of their situation began to settle upon the Marines as the reality of their isolation became undeniable. They were thousands of kilometers from American territory, deep in waters controlled by Japanese aircraft and warships, supplied with whatever they had managed to bring ashore or capture from the enemy, and facing an enemy who had not yet suffered a significant defeat and who showed no signs of accepting American presence on Guadalcanal. The confidence and energy that had characterized the landing itself gave way to a more realistic understanding that the Marines faced weeks or months of difficult combat, that casualties would be significant, and that holding the airfield would require extraordinary endurance and sacrifice. Senior officers worked to maintain morale, even as they organized defenses and prepared contingency plans in case Japanese attacks broke through the perimeter. Letters written during these days reveal the mental state of Marines who understood they were engaged in something unprecedented in American military history: an amphibious invasion deep in enemy territory, with no possibility of retreat, and with survival dependent on holding ground against an enemy with interior lines of communication and the ability to reinforce and resupply across relatively short distances. Yet the Marines persisted, and the work continued, and Henderson Field was primed. The landing on Guadalcanal on the morning of August 7th proceeded with a speed that caught even the American commanders by surprise. By midday, more than 20,000 Marines had come ashore, and the airfield was within reach. For a few precious hours, the Americans operated under the assumption that they had achieved something rare in warfare: a clean tactical victory with minimal opposition. But that assumption was about to be shattered by one of the most brutal and consequential realizations of the entire Pacific War. Japanese command, watching from their bases in Rabaul and the northern Solomon Islands, had been aware of American movements for hours. Signal intelligence, reconnaissance patrols, and simple observation had all confirmed what the Americans themselves were only beginning to understand. The invasion of Guadalcanal was real, it was large, and it demanded an immediate response that would transform the waters around the island into a crucible of naval and aerial combat. The Japanese military had never experienced a major amphibious landing against their territory before. Their naval strategists had always assumed that Japanese naval superiority in the waters surrounding their territorial holdings would prevent any American attempt to assault their positions. The surprise and the scale of the Guadalcanal invasion sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure from Rabaul to Tokyo. Within hours of receiving the initial reports, Japanese air commanders began organizing strikes against the American fleet and the transports still lying offshore. These were not hastily improvised attacks. They were coordinated assaults by trained squadrons equipped with some of the best aircraft in the Japanese inventory at that moment. The Japanese Navy's air arm still possessed significant striking power, and for the first 3 days of the invasion, that power would be on full display. American naval commanders, watching the skies and monitoring their radar screens, prepared their ships for what they knew would come, a relentless aerial onslaught that would test every anti-aircraft gun, every fighter pilot, and every crew aboard the American warships. The first coordinated Japanese airstrikes arrived over Guadalcanal on the morning of August 8th, just 24 hours after the Marines had come ashore. Aircraft from Rabaul and forward air bases in the northern Solomons launched attacks that involved dozens of planes, a force that represented the rapid concentration of Japanese air power in response to the invasion threat. American radar operators aboard the ships detected the incoming formations at considerable distance, giving precious minutes for fighters to scramble and crews to man their anti-aircraft batteries. The ensuing aerial combats were chaotic and intense, with American F-4F Wildcat fighters clawing for altitude to intercept the Japanese aircraft before they could strike at the vulnerable transport ships below. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of years of warfare in China and the Pacific, flew with considerable skill and determination, pressing home their attacks despite American fighter opposition. The sky above Sealark Channel, the body of water separating Guadalcanal from the neighboring islands, became a swirling arena of aircraft, turning and diving, tracers lacing across blue sky, and the thunder of engines and machine gun fire, creating an almost constant roar. During those first 3 days of intense aerial combat, the Americans suffered losses that shocked the fleet commanders and reinforced a brutal truth about amphibious operations. The invasion fleet and the Marines it carried were terrifyingly vulnerable to air attack. The American cruiser Astoria was struck by Japanese aircraft and damaged so severely that she eventually sank. The transport ship USS Elliott was hit and damaged. Other ships sustained damage from near misses and strafing runs. But the most significant casualty was neither a warship nor a transport. It was the realization that swept through the American Naval Command that the fleet could not remain in waters dominated by Japanese air power without suffering catastrophic losses. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force that had provided initial support to the invasion, made a decision that would echo through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, concluding that his carriers could not operate safely in the confined waters around Guadalcanal, given the proximity of Japanese air bases. Fletcher withdrew his carrier task force to safer waters to the south. The Marines on the beach, already aware that their supply ships would soon have to depart, suddenly understood that they were being left alone. The withdrawal of American naval forces, while militarily necessary from the perspective of fleet preservation, created an immediate and desperate situation for the Marines ashore. The supply ships, the ammunition vessels, the hospital ships, and the transport vessels that had delivered the invasion force could not remain without naval protection. The order was given for the fleet to depart, and over the course of August 8th and 9th, the American ships weighed anchor and steamed away from Guadalcanal. The Marines watched from the beach as the ships that had carried them across the ocean disappeared over the horizon, and the full weight of their isolation settled over the perimeter like a physical force. They had landed with sufficient ammunition and supplies for several weeks, but they had not landed with stockpiles designed to sustain nearly 20,000 men through a prolonged siege. The realization that they would have to hold Henderson Field, defend the perimeter, and somehow supply themselves while enduring attacks from both the sea and the air, created a psychological shock that complemented the physical shock of combat. The Japanese responded to the withdrawal of American naval forces by intensifying their own efforts to reinforce their garrisons on Guadalcanal and to mount coordinated counterattacks against the marine perimeter. If Japanese commanders could organize a successful ground assault while American naval forces were absent and American supply lines remained severed, they believed they might still be able to drive the Americans off the island. Japanese troops in garrisons around Guadalcanal began moving toward the airfield to concentrate for attacks. Japanese naval forces began preparing for surface operations under cover of darkness, operations that would eventually become famous to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. Japanese air attacks continued with diminished frequency as American fighters became more effective at defending against them, but the attacks continued nonetheless. The three-day period from August 7th through August 9th represented a turning point not just in the Guadalcanal campaign, but in the larger war in the Pacific. American naval superiority, which had seemed assured after the victories at the Coral Sea and Midway, proved to be insufficient in these confined waters dominated by Japanese air bases and Japanese determined resistance. The air battles that raged above Guadalcanal during the first week and beyond represented a new form of warfare that neither side had fully anticipated. American fighter pilots, many of them fresh to combat, found themselves facing experienced Japanese aviators who had been fighting in China for years and had already spent months engaged in aerial combat across the Pacific. The Japanese Zero fighter, with its superior maneuverability and climbing ability, initially proved to be a formidable opponent for the American F-4F Wildcat. But American pilots, guided by experienced commanders and learning lessons from each engagement, began to understand the weaknesses of the Zero and how to exploit them. The Wildcat was more rugged, more heavily armed, and could sustain greater damage without being shot down. American pilots learned to avoid the turning dogfights where the Zero excelled, and instead used the superior strength and diving ability of their own aircraft. They learned to work in pairs and small groups rather than as individual pilots seeking personal glory. The air battles became progressively more favorable to the Americans as the days and weeks wore on, but in those first chaotic days, the outcome remained uncertain. The naval battles that accompanied the aerial combat added another layer of desperate fighting to the Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of August 12th, only 5 days after the initial marine landings, a Japanese naval task force consisting of cruisers and destroyers steamed down the channel toward the American anchorage, intent on bombarding the Marines ashore and attacking the few remaining American warships in the area. American naval forces, built around a few cruisers and destroyers, moved to intercept the Japanese force. The resulting engagement, fought at night in the narrow waters off Guadalcanal, was a chaotic and confused battle in which both sides inflicted damage, but neither achieved a decisive victory. American ships were hit and damaged. A Japanese cruiser was damaged. The Americans were forced to withdraw, leaving the impression that the night belonged to the Japanese, and that Japanese surface forces could operate in these waters with relative impunity. The loss of American naval superiority in the nighttime hours created a second vulnerability for the Marines ashore. While American air superiority was gradually being established during daylight hours, the nights belonged to the Japanese. The combination of Japanese air attacks during daylight and Japanese surface operations during darkness created a strategic situation that the Marines had never imagined when they departed their transport ships in the landing craft on August 7th. They controlled the island, or at least the portion of the island around the airfield and the established perimeter, but they did not control the waters offshore, and they did not control the airspace above the island when Japanese aircraft were present. The supply line back to American bases in the South Pacific, a line that stretched hundreds of kilometers across open ocean, was under constant threat. Any attempt to send supply ships to Guadalcanal had to be protected by warships that were themselves vulnerable to Japanese air attack. The Marines found themselves in a position that military theorists would have called untenable, invading an island thousands of kilometers from their nearest secure base, far from adequate naval protection, and surrounded by Japanese forces that showed no signs of accepting defeat or abandoning their positions. Yet the Japanese, despite their apparent advantages in air and naval power, found themselves facing a strategic problem of their own. The Americans ashore on Guadalcanal, despite their isolation and supply shortages, had established a strong defensive perimeter. They had the airfield, or at least access to it once American planes could begin operating from it. And they had demonstrated a fighting capability that surprised Japanese commanders who had grown accustomed to rapid victories against lightly armed or poorly trained opponents. The Japanese garrisons on Guadalcanal were themselves vulnerable. They had been cut off by the American invasion from their own supply lines to the north, and they could not be easily resupplied while American forces controlled the island's center. Japanese commanders faced a choice. They could attempt to overwhelm the Americans through concentrated assaults before American reinforcements and supplies could arrive, or they could accept a prolonged campaign of attrition in which Japanese logistics would be tested against American industrial capacity. Japanese military culture and Japanese military command both favored the first option, the aggressive assault, the overwhelming offensive, the victory through willpower and martial superiority. They would begin organizing attacks within hours, attacks that would shape the entire middle phase of the Guadalcanal campaign. The realization that spread through the marine perimeter in the days following the naval withdrawal was not despair, but rather a kind of grim clarity. The Americans had achieved the first critical objective. They had landed on the island, established a foothold, and captured the airfield, but they had done so at the cost of their immediate connection to the sea and to the supply lines that sustained modern military forces. They understood that they were now locked in a battle for survival, a battle in which they would have to hold the airfield against Japanese attacks, endure shortages of food and ammunition, and gradually build up their own position, while denying the Japanese the opportunity to overwhelm them. The tropical sun that beat down on the perimeter, the insects and disease that would soon begin to take a toll, and the Japanese soldiers who were organizing for attack all seemed to conspire to make the survival of the American position uncertain. But the Marines, trained for amphibious assault and now committed to holding their foothold on Guadalcanal, prepared themselves for what would become a 3-month struggle that would test not just their military skills, but their endurance, their courage, and their determination to see a victory through to its completion. The first response from Japanese command to the American invasion had revealed both the strengths and the limitations of Japanese military power in the Pacific. Japanese air and naval forces had reacted quickly and had achieved some successes against the American fleet. But those successes had not been overwhelming, had not driven the Americans off the island, and had not prevented the establishment of a strong marine perimeter around the airfield. American naval forces had been forced to withdraw, but they would return. American reinforcements would arrive, though not as quickly as the Marines ashore might have hoped. And American industrial capacity, the same industrial machine that had been building ships and aircraft since before Pearl Harbor, was only beginning to turn toward the Pacific theater. The 3-month campaign that would follow, a campaign characterized by desperate Japanese assaults and increasingly effective American defenses would reveal that the islands of the Pacific could not be held by courage and determination alone. They could only be held by the side that could sustain its forces through the long campaigns of attrition and supply that separated tactical victories from strategic success. The American fleet had departed Guadalcanal's waters in retreat, their ships shadowed by Japanese aircraft and harassed by the threat of surface attack. The destroyers and cruisers that had supported the landings were gone, vanished into the blue expanse beyond the horizon, leaving nearly 20,000 Marines to fend for themselves in a hostile landscape they barely understood. On the island, in the sweltering humidity and gathering gloom of early evening on that first day, the realization began to settle over every man. They were alone. Not abandoned. Supply ships would come, reinforcements would follow. That was the promise from headquarters. But for now, in the gathering darkness of August 7th, 1942, the Marines of Guadalcanal stood on their own, beneath a sky that belonged to enemies they had yet to fully meet. The beach positions they had secured with such speed that morning suddenly felt less like a triumph and more like the beginning of an ordeal whose end no one could see. Officers moved among their men, checking positions, taking inventory of ammunition and supplies, and speaking in steady tones about the work ahead. The jungle pressed close on three sides, a wall of green so dense it seemed to have weight and intention, and somewhere within it, unseen and uncounted, were Japanese soldiers who knew this island far better than the Americans did. The first priority was not to hunt the enemy, but to establish a perimeter that could withstand assault from multiple directions. Marine engineers and combat troops worked through the night and into the days that followed, stringing barbed wire, digging gun positions, constructing observation posts, and clearing fields of fire where the coconut palms and jungle growth had been too thick. The perimeter stretched roughly in a semicircle around the half-finished Japanese airfield, which was the heart of everything that mattered on Guadalcanal. To hold the airfield meant to hold the island. To lose it meant to lose the ability to resupply by air, to receive reinforcements, and to project any kind of power across the Solomon Islands. Engineers raced against time they could not see, working in shifts, their clothes soaked with sweat, hands blistered from digging and chopping, understanding that every hour spent preparing defenses was an hour that might save lives when the Japanese attacks came. The work was endless and exhausting, but every Marine knew the reason for it. The Japanese were not passive. They were organizing, regrouping, moving forces toward the American perimeter, with the intention of driving the invaders back into the sea. The race was between American preparation and Japanese assault, and preparation could not be allowed to lose. Throughout the first week of August, the reality of Guadalcanal's climate began to assert itself with force that no training exercise could have prepared them for. The heat was absolute and suffocating, a living weight that pressed down from the moment the sun cleared the horizon and did not lift until well after darkness fell. Humidity hung in the air so thickly that it was like breathing through wet cloth. Sweat poured from every man regardless of exertion, soaking uniforms, softening skin, creating conditions where fungal infections could take root within hours. The jungle itself was alive with insects that seemed designed by nature specifically to torment human beings. Mosquitoes that appeared in clouds and bit through cloth, sandflies that left itching welts, ants that stung with venom that made grown men cry out, and creatures whose names the Marines did not know, but whose presence was felt in every brush against exposed skin. The coconut palms provided some shade, but beneath that shade lay rot and decomposition, the constant seething of a tropical ecosystem where things died and dissolved back into mud and nutrients almost before they stopped moving. Water became a critical concern. Every man needed it constantly, and the water that was available was contaminated by the very insects and decay that surrounded them. Officers had to order men to drink, to avoid the dehydration that could kill as surely as a Japanese bullet, and to drink water that tasted of chemicals and made the stomach uncertain. Within days, dysentery appeared in the camps, moving through units like an invisible enemy, claiming men to latrines, and sickness nearly as effectively as combat could have done. The nights were when the Japanese showed their hand most clearly. As darkness fell across the island, Japanese patrols would move out from their garrisons, testing the American perimeter, seeking weak points, trying to understand what they faced. The darkness under the jungle canopy was nearly absolute, a blackness that made every sound seem magnified, and every shadow a potential threat. Marines lay in their positions, straining to see shapes that would not come clear, listening to the sounds of the jungle, the calls of birds and creatures unknown, the rustle of movement, the crack of a branch, and trying to distinguish the natural from the man-made, the animal from the human enemy. Firefights would erupt suddenly from sections of the perimeter where alert sentries had spotted movement or heard voices that did not belong to Americans. These were not the massive assaults that would come later. They were probes and skirmishes, brief flares of violence followed by silence as quickly as they had begun. In the darkness, a Marine might fire into the jungle and see nothing, or glimpse a shadowy figure only to have it vanish before he could be certain he had truly seen anything at all. The psychological effect of these nightly contacts was significant. It meant no one could fully sleep, that every man went through each daylight hour after a night of broken rest and high alertness. The morale impact of uncertainty, not knowing how many Japanese were out there, not knowing when the next attack would come or from which direction, was as much a weapon in the hands of the enemy as any gun or artillery piece. The capture and securing of Henderson Field was the achievement that made everything else possible. The Japanese had been constructing an airfield before the American invasion, and the Marines had found it far less defended than anyone had feared. By the afternoon of the first day, enough troops had been brought ashore to push inland and secure the airfield without meeting organized resistance, a victory that seemed almost too easy, too clean. But the intelligence that had suggested light defenses on the airfield had not been entirely accurate. Large Japanese forces were present elsewhere on the island, in strong points and garrison positions that the Marine commanders were still mapping and still uncertain about. The airfield itself was incomplete. The runway was graded but rough. The facilities were partial, and everything about it spoke of Japanese construction methods that were different from what American engineers expected. Yet this unfinished runway was the most valuable piece of real estate on the island. American planners had always known that aircraft operating from Guadalcanal would be the key to holding it. Without air cover, the Marines would be dependent on naval support that could not always be provided, on supply runs by ship that would be vulnerable to Japanese air attack, and on their own infantry strength to withstand attacks that would come with increasing frequency and violence. With aircraft, with fighters that could intercept Japanese bombers before they reached the island, with dive bombers that could strike at Japanese naval forces trying to reinforce the island, with transport planes bringing supplies and reinforcements, the island could be held and the campaign could succeed. Engineers threw themselves into the work of finishing the airfield with the energy of men who understood that their work was measured in lives. Bulldozers and hand tools worked the coral and soil, spreading and compacting, filling in soft spots, extending the runway to length sufficient for the American fighters and transport aircraft that were supposed to arrive. The work happened under the threat of air attack, which meant that work parties had to be prepared to scatter into the jungle on a moment's notice whenever aircraft were spotted to the north. Several times each day, lookouts would shout warnings, and men would abandon their equipment and dive for whatever cover the inadequate jungle provided, lying flat and still while Japanese aircraft descended on the airfield and the positions around it, dropping bombs and strafing with machine gun fire. The damage was always limited by the lack of concentration. Japanese pilots could not spend long over the island without risking interception or running low on fuel, but the psychological effect was constant. Every day brought reminders that the Marines were not safe here, that the enemy could reach them from the sky, and that the work they were doing was happening in a place that was very much still part of the active battlefield. When the Japanese attacks would pass, and the all clear would sound, the work parties would emerge from the jungle, sometimes finding comrades wounded or killed, sometimes finding that hours of work had been destroyed by a few well-placed bombs, and they would return to their digging, and their spreading, and their compacting, knowing that the airfield had to be ready. The schedule was that American aircraft were supposed to begin arriving within a matter of days. Those aircraft would change everything. Behind the struggle to establish the perimeter and complete the airfield lay another struggle that received less notice but was equally vital: the struggle to manage supplies that were almost immediately inadequate. The ships that had landed the initial assault force had brought enough supplies for a short operation, with the expectation that resupply ships would arrive regularly and keep the Marines provisioned. But Japanese naval and air threats made regular resupply hazardous and unreliable. Ships would attempt to run supplies down from bases to the south, but they were vulnerable to air attack during daylight hours, and nighttime runs by fast warships and transports meant that supplies arrived in smaller quantities than needed. Officers had to make decisions about rationing almost immediately, accepting that every Marine would receive less food than he required, that ammunition would have to be carefully managed, and that some supplies would run critically short. The rations that did arrive were often damaged by salt water from the rough journey, or spoiled by the tropical heat and humidity, and the water situation remained precarious. Fresh fruit was available on the island itself, coconuts, and some other local produce, but the jungle was not reliably generous, and much of it could cause disease if not properly prepared. Marines grew hungry in the first week itself, and within days the situation would begin to worsen. Officers watched their men and saw the awareness beginning to form in their eyes. They were not going to be comfortable here, they were not going to have enough of what they needed, and they were going to have to make do with less than less. The physical toll of insufficient food combined with heavy labor and tropical disease was going to mount steadily as the weeks progressed. The command structure on the island was established quickly, and leadership at multiple levels became apparent in the way decisions were made and orders executed. The overall commander of the operation was a general who had been chosen specifically for his willingness to take the risk of landing on Guadalcanal in the first place, and below him were colonels and majors who organized the divisions and regiments and battalions into the positions that made up the perimeter. These officers moved constantly through the lines, visiting their men, understanding firsthand what conditions were like, making decisions about where to concentrate resources and where to reinforce positions that seemed vulnerable. The quality of leadership at this level was highly variable. Some officers adapted quickly to the pace and the reality of what Guadalcanal demanded, while others seemed to operate from a playbook of conventional wisdom that did not quite fit the situation. But the system generally worked, and orders got passed down through the chain of command to company commanders and platoon sergeants and squad leaders who bore the actual responsibility for their men's survival. Discipline was crucial. The temptation to withdraw, to conserve ammunition, to avoid unnecessary contact with the enemy was constant and understandable. Officers had to maintain standards and push their men to maintain alert defense, knowing that complacency or hesitation at the perimeter could allow a Japanese breakthrough that might not be recoverable. By the end of the first week of August, the perimeter around Henderson Field had taken on the appearance of something more permanent than a momentary position. Trenches and gun pits dotted the landscape. Barbed wire formed barriers between the American positions and the approaches from the jungle, and marine artillery had been positioned to cover the open ground that the Japanese would have to cross if they attempted a frontal assault. The airfield itself was passable, though far from ideal, and the first American aircraft were arriving, small numbers at first, but growing as more pilots and more planes made the dangerous flight from bases to the south. The presence of American aircraft changed the psychological atmosphere on the island immediately. When Wildcats took off from Henderson Field to intercept Japanese aircraft, when bombs fell on Japanese positions inland, when American pilots returned from patrol and landed with stories of combat in the skies, the Marines felt the first genuine sense that the island might be held, that the campaign might succeed. But the fighting had not yet reached its intensity. The probes and skirmishes of the first week were merely the preliminary reconnaissance, the enemy feeling the American strength and determining where the main assault would come. The question of Japanese strength and disposition remained uncertain throughout the first week. American intelligence suggested that there were several thousand Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, but the exact numbers and their exact locations were still matters of conjecture. Some Japanese forces had retreated when the Marines landed, moving to defensive positions in the jungle interior, waiting for reinforcements and for the opportunity to counterattack in force. Others had been killed in the initial landings or the skirmishes of the first days. The American commanders on the island knew they were not facing the full strength of the Japanese military. Reinforcements were coming. More troops would be shipped down from bases in the northern Solomon Islands and from Rabaul, but they did not know exactly how many were coming or when they would arrive. This uncertainty was almost as dangerous as the actual enemy presence. It forced every decision to be made under the assumption that the worst-case scenario was possible, that a huge Japanese force might appear at any moment with the intention of pushing the Americans back into the sea. Every reconnaissance patrol, every interrogation of prisoners, every analysis of captured documents was an attempt to reduce this uncertainty, to understand what the Marines actually faced. And as the first week of August drew to a close, the Marines realized that they were winning a race they had not fully understood they were in. The race to establish a perimeter strong enough to withstand the assault that was coming. They could feel it in the jungle, in the reports of Japanese activity, in the tone of radio reports from higher command. The Japanese were regrouping, reinforcing, preparing their response. The real battle for Guadalcanal was about to begin, and the work of the past week, the perimeter, the airfield, the defensive positions, the artillery placement, would determine whether the Marines could survive what came next. The Japanese army in the Pacific had not yet lost a major engagement. In the months since their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and their stunning conquest of vast territories across Southeast Asia and the island chains, Japanese commanders had come to believe in their own invincibility. Their soldiers had been trained from childhood in the code of honor known as Bushido, taught that surrender meant shame and that death in service to the emperor was the highest calling a man could achieve. This mindset had served them well in rapid campaigns against less prepared enemies. But Guadalcanal was different. The Americans had arrived unannounced, landed thousands of troops, and seized the precious airfield that Japanese forces had spent weeks constructing. The shock of this reversal was severe. and Japanese command was determined to erase it with overwhelming force. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded a Japanese force of roughly 900 men drawn from the 35th Infantry Regiment, a unit considered elite by Japanese standards. These soldiers had not yet faced sustained resistance on their own terms. They had fought in China, where resistance had been scattered and poorly organized. They believed themselves superior in close-quarters combat, disciplined, and possessed of a warrior spirit that would overwhelm any opponent. Ichiki was ordered to eliminate the American presence on Guadalcanal and retake the airfield. He was promised that additional forces would arrive within days to support his assault. What he did not know was that Japanese naval and air losses in the waters around Guadalcanal had become so severe that reinforcements would be delayed and would arrive in far smaller numbers than promised. Ichiki was being sent into battle with incomplete information and insufficient resources, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the campaign and would ultimately seal the fate of the Japanese defense of the island. On the night of August 20th, as darkness fell over the island, Ichiki's force moved toward the marine perimeter, guided by scouts who claimed to know the location of American positions. The Marines had established their main defensive line roughly along the Tenaru River, a shallow waterway that ran across the island's northern coast, not far from the seized airfield. The river itself was not a significant obstacle, but it provided a natural point of reference and a defensible boundary. Major John Lejeune Cresswell, a career Marine officer, commanded the defensive sector that would face Ichiki's assault. Cresswell had positioned his men carefully, with machine gun nests covering the likely crossing points and artillery set back at distances from which it could support the infantry. The Marines had learned, during their first days on the island, that the Japanese would attack at night when darkness gave them whatever advantage they could find. Every Marine in the perimeter understood that the coming darkness would bring fighting. The American lines were manned primarily by the 1st Marine Regiment and elements of the 5th Regiment, along with a handful of attached artillery and support personnel. These troops had been on the island for only 2 weeks. They were exhausted from working parties that had strengthened the perimeter and from the constant psychological strain of knowing that the enemy was out there in the dark, probing for weakness. Many of the Marines had never fired their weapons in actual combat before arriving on Guadalcanal. They had trained for months, but training in the continental United States could not truly prepare a man for the darkness of a tropical island, the sounds of the jungle, or the knowledge that enemies armed with bayonets and grenades were moving toward them through the undergrowth. Yet these men held their positions and waited. Some wrote letters they expected would be their last. Others checked their weapons one final time, a ritual that brought a degree of comfort through its familiarity and purpose. The night before a battle is perhaps the longest night a soldier can experience. Ichiki's plan was straightforward and reflected the tactical doctrine of the Japanese army in this period. He would concentrate his force against the American position, attack at night when visibility was poorest, and overwhelm the defenders through aggressive assault and superior fighting spirit. The Japanese had little appreciation for the devastating effect of massed machine gun fire against infantry in the open or against infantry attempting to cross a river. Their tactics emphasized the moral and psychological superiority of the individual soldier and the power of determination and courage to overcome material disadvantages. This belief had proven adequate against Chinese forces armed with older weapons and poorly coordinated defensive positions. But the United States Marine Corps in 1942 had access to modern weapons, was trained in systematic defensive tactics, and was fighting for its survival on an island from which there was no retreat. The collision between Japanese tactical doctrine and American defensive firepower would produce a result that no Japanese commander anticipated. In the pre-dawn hours of August 21st, Ichiki's force began its assault. Japanese soldiers, many of them singing as they came, approached the Tenaru River with a combination of caution and confidence. Some accounts suggest that scouts or prisoners had provided information about the American positions, but this information was incomplete or inaccurate. When the Japanese reached the river and began to cross at multiple points, American defenders opened fire with devastating effect. The machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, poured thousands of rounds into the crossing point. Artillery, having been ranged in on the river in advance of the expected attack, began firing high-explosive shells that detonated among clusters of Japanese soldiers with terrible effect. The night became a chaos of muzzle flashes, explosions, and the terrible screams of wounded men. Japanese soldiers, trained to advance against all obstacles, pressed forward despite the losses mounting around them. Some reached the American lines. Some even penetrated short distances into the marine perimeter before being driven back or killed in hand-to-hand fighting. The battle lasted only a few hours, though to the men engaged in it, the time seemed to stretch indefinitely. Japanese soldiers showed extraordinary courage and determination, repeatedly attempting to overwhelm the American position despite mounting casualties. They charged across open ground in the face of direct fire, assaulted entrenched positions with bayonets and hand grenades, and fought to the death rather than retreat. A number of them did reach the marine lines and engaged in desperate close-quarters combat with American riflemen and machine gunners, and in those moments, the Japanese warriors came closest to achieving their objectives. But the marine positions held. The supporting artillery, the overlapping machine gun fire, and the discipline of American troops trained to hold their ground in the face of assault proved decisive. When the dawn came, and the darkness that had protected the Japanese assault dissipated, the result was unmistakable. The Japanese force, which had begun the night at roughly 900 men, had suffered casualties numbering more than half that force. Several hundred Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying around the Tenaru River, their bodies draped across the river itself and scattered through the approaches to the American perimeter. The surviving Japanese soldiers, faced with the shocking realization that their assault had failed and that they faced an enemy they could not overcome through willpower and aggressive tactics, retreated into the jungle. Some were killed by pursuing Marines. Others made their way back toward the main Japanese garrison on the island, spreading word that the Americans were far stronger and better prepared than anyone in Japanese command had anticipated. The Marines themselves were shaken by the experience. They had held their ground, they had inflicted enormous losses, and they had proven that they could fight effectively in darkness against an enemy trained in night assault tactics. But the ferocity of the Japanese attack and the apparent willingness of Japanese soldiers to continue assaulting even after it became clear that they would be killed had revealed something about the nature of the enemy they faced. This was not an enemy that could be intimidated, that would surrender when facing superior force, or that would retreat when losses became severe. This was an enemy trained from youth to view surrender as shameful and death in combat as preferable to capture or retreat. The political and psychological impact of the Battle of the Tenaru extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the victory proved that they could stand against Japanese assault and that the enemy was not invincible. It restored confidence in themselves and in their commanders. The heavy Japanese casualties also meant that Japanese forces on the island would be weakened and that future assaults would be more difficult to mount. For the Japanese command structure, both on Guadalcanal and in the higher echelons of military leadership, the battle was a shock. They had expected that a force of disciplined, well-trained soldiers under an effective commander would be able to overwhelm a hastily landed American force far from home and lacking air support. That expectation had proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese commanders on the island now understood that they faced a far more difficult task than they had anticipated, and that the conquest of Guadalcanal would require not quick assault, but sustained, grinding warfare. In the days following the Tenaru battle, Japanese command began preparing for what would prove to be a much longer and more costly campaign. Additional forces were committed to Guadalcanal, though not in the overwhelming numbers that would have been necessary to drive the Americans from the island. Japanese naval forces continued to suffer losses in the waters around Guadalcanal, making supply and reinforcement increasingly difficult. The marine perimeter, meanwhile, began to stabilize, and American aircraft operating from the repaired Henderson Field began to gain dominance over the skies above the island. The tactical advantage that the Japanese had possessed in the first days of the campaign, when American forces were largely unsupported by air power and fighting in darkness, was fading. The Tenaru River ran red with blood on the morning of August 21st, but the battle itself was a turning point not for Japanese aspirations, but for the reality of their situation on Guadalcanal. The men who had fought at the Tenaru knew they had participated in something significant, though they could not have known at the time how far the consequences would reach. The victory against Ichiki's assault provided a demonstration of American capability that rippled through the Pacific theater and began to shift thinking among American commanders who had questioned whether the Marines could actually defeat a determined Japanese force in a sustained campaign. The Marines, for their part, understood that they had proven something essential about themselves and about American fighting ability. But the battle was also a harbinger of the grinding attrition to come. If Japan was willing to commit elite forces and absorb enormous casualties in the attempt to retake Guadalcanal, then the Marines would have to be prepared for months of combat, not just a quick victory. The airfield that they had seized and the small perimeter that they had established were not the end of the campaign, but merely the beginning of a much longer and deadlier struggle. As August drew to a close, the Marines on Guadalcanal settled into what would become their existence for the next 4 months. Days of jungle combat, nights of alert vigilance, the constant presence of disease and hunger, and the knowledge that more attacks would come. Japanese forces, reinforced despite the losses at Tenaru, gathered to the south and east of the American perimeter, preparing for the coordinated assaults that would characterize the middle phase of the campaign. The Marines, reinforced more slowly but more consistently as American supply lines gradually stabilized, prepared their defenses and waited for the enemy to come again. The Tenaru River had become a barrier that the Japanese could not cross, at least not in the numbers that would have been necessary to overwhelm the American position. But the battle had not ended the campaign. It had only transformed it from a question of whether the Marines could hold the island into a question of how long the Japanese would continue trying to take it, and at what cost. In the first week of August, when the Marines fought to secure Henderson Field amid the jungle and chaos of Guadalcanal, the airfield remained an objective, not yet a weapon. Japanese aircraft ruled the skies above the island with near-total dominance, striking at American ships, harassing the troops ashore, and demonstrating the technological reach that had allowed Japan to sweep across the Pacific with such devastating speed. American pilots flying from distant bases could offer only limited protection, arriving hours after attacks had begun, their fuel supplies stretched to the breaking point by the vast distances involved. The Marines on the ground felt this absence acutely, watching the sky with dread each time the drone of Japanese engines announced another raid. For those early days, the airfield was a prize to be captured, but not yet a sanctuary where American power could take root and grow. The completion and activation of Henderson Field marked the moment when the campaign for Guadalcanal began its transformation from a desperate defensive struggle into something resembling an actual fight for air superiority above the island. The work of repairing and extending the existing Japanese airfield proceeded with frantic urgency throughout the first and second weeks of August. American combat engineers and construction battalions, working in punishing heat beneath the tropical sun, moved dirt and coral, smoothed the runway surface, and established fuel storage areas and ammunition magazines beneath camouflage and jungle cover. The runway itself was adequate, though rough. It was sufficient to accept the stubby, rugged fighter aircraft that would soon begin operating from it. Mechanics and ground crews arrived by transport plane in groups, setting up shop in hastily constructed wooden structures and underground shelters, preparing maintenance stands and ammunition lockers for the aircraft that were promised to come. The perimeter Marines defended these workers with desperate vigilance, knowing that the airfield's completion was not merely important, but existential to the survival of the entire operation. Japanese artillery occasionally shelled the construction site, and patrols clashed in the jungle surrounding the airfield, but the Americans pushed ahead, driven by an understanding that every day that passed without a functioning airfield meant another day of near-total vulnerability to air attack. The first Marine aircraft to arrive at Henderson Field touched down in the middle of August, their arrival greeted by a surge of relief and hope among the exhausted troops on the ground that had been without air cover for over a week. These were Vought F-4F Wildcat fighters, stocky and powerful machines that seemed almost crude compared to the sleek Japanese Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies. But they possessed qualities that would prove decisive over the coming months. The Wildcat was tougher than the Zero, with more armor protecting the pilot and fuel tanks filled with self-sealing foam that could survive hits that would cause other aircraft to ignite in flame. It could dive faster than the Zero and turn tighter at higher speeds, though it could not match the Japanese fighter in maneuverability at lower speeds or climb rate at altitude. American pilots arriving at Henderson Field brought experience from earlier engagements and an understanding of the Wildcat's strengths and limitations that would allow them to use the aircraft to maximum effect. The presence of even a handful of fighters at dawn the next morning changed the psychological reality on the ground. Marines looked up at the sky with something other than pure dread for the first time since the invasion began. The first engagements between American Wildcats and Japanese Zeros occurred over Guadalcanal in mid-August, brief and violent encounters that lasted minutes and often resulted in at least one aircraft spiraling into the jungle or the sea trailing smoke. American pilots like John L. Smith, who would emerge as one of the most successful fighter leaders in the Pacific War, learned through hard experience and rapid iteration how to employ the Wildcat against an opponent that was in many ways superior in raw flying characteristics. The technique that emerged was born of necessity and ruthlessness. American pilots would dive away from Japanese fighters, exploiting the Wildcat's superior diving speed, then climb and attack from angles and altitudes where the Zero's advantages could not be brought to bear. This tactic required discipline, coordination, and the courage to turn away from an enemy when doing so felt like cowardice. Though every experienced pilot understood that retreating to better tactical position was not retreat at all. The learning curve was steep and measured in American pilots who did not return, but within weeks, The Marines at Henderson Field had begun to systematize their air defense and to create procedures for scrambling fighters when Japanese aircraft were detected by radar or by human observers. The flow of information improved, and the response times shortened, and the casualty rates among American pilots gradually stabilized as tactics matured. Japanese aircraft continued to arrive over Guadalcanal almost daily throughout August and into September, sometimes in small formations and sometimes in waves of dozens of bombers escorted by fighters that could engage American defenders over the island or over the surrounding waters. The Japanese pilots, many of them experienced and hardened by months of combat across China and Southeast Asia, possessed superior individual flying skills and intimate knowledge of their aircraft's capabilities. However, the Japanese air forces operating from bases in Rabaul and the northern Solomon Islands faced mounting losses that could not be easily replaced, and replacement pilots lacked the training and experience of the men they replaced. American pilot losses were also significant, but American pilot training programs were producing replacement pilots and new fighters at a rate that gradually allowed American strengths to overcome Japanese advantages. The air battles that raged above Guadalcanal became a grinding attrition campaign in which both sides wore down, but where American industrial capacity and manpower reserves gave the United States an incremental but ultimately decisive advantage over the coming months. Each day that passed brought more American fighters to Henderson Field and saw Japanese air strength incrementally decline as experienced pilots were lost and experienced pilots on the American side survived, accumulated experience, and trained younger pilots in the tactics that worked. By late August, American fighter sweeps began to extend beyond the immediate vicinity of Guadalcanal, with wildcat formations flying northward to intercept Japanese aircraft before they could even reach the island or to harass Japanese bases in the northern Solomon Islands. These offensive missions extended the reach of American air power and forced Japanese pilots to operate at greater risk and with reduced fuel reserves for the return flight to their bases. The psychological effect on Marines on the ground was profound. Instead of watching helplessly as Japanese aircraft attacked, they could see American fighters disappearing into the sky toward the north, heading toward the enemy with purpose and aggression. When the American fighters returned, their pilots would report successes or engage in heated discussions about tactics and aircraft performance, and a culture of air superiority began to develop at Henderson Field, despite the fact that the campaign was far from decided. Maintenance crews worked through the night to keep aircraft flyable, and pilots volunteered for extra missions despite the cumulative fatigue and psychological strain of repeated combat. The airfield became not just a facility, but a living organism of American determination and resolve, a place where men worked beyond normal human endurance, in service of a cause that seemed increasingly achievable as the days and weeks passed. The role of ground support missions grew increasingly important as the campaign developed, with American fighters carrying bombs and ammunition to strafe Japanese positions and to provide direct fire support to Marine ground units engaged in combat. These missions required coordination between pilots and ground commanders, a capability that was developed and refined through trial and error, and sometimes tragic miscommunication. American pilots learned to read the terrain from the air and to recognize smoke signals and other markers that ground units used to identify their positions and to call in strikes against enemy positions. The destructive power of aircraft delivering bombs and cannon fire against concentrated Japanese formations proved devastating, and the psychological impact on troops under air attack was crushing. Japanese soldiers began to understand that the day sky above Guadalcanal belonged to Americans, and that moving during daylight hours meant risking encounter with aircraft that could kill with speed and precision. The integration of air power into the ground campaign represented a new form of warfare, one in which the Marines on the ground depended on pilots they had never met to protect them and to strike enemy positions, creating bonds of trust that were as important as ammunition and rations. The Japanese response to American air superiority was to commit more and more aircraft to combat over Guadalcanal, a strategy that accelerated their losses and hastened the depletion of experienced pilot strength throughout the Japanese Navy. Some Japanese aircraft were diverted from other theaters to replace losses, but this meant weakening Japanese air forces elsewhere in the Pacific and sacrificing the flexibility that Japan's air forces had previously enjoyed. Japanese commanders in Rabaul understood the mathematics of attrition and the fact that American industrial production and training capacity would eventually overcome Japanese advantages, but they had little choice but to continue committing aircraft to the struggle for Guadalcanal, because abandoning the island was politically and strategically unacceptable to Japanese high command. The skies above Guadalcanal thus became a cauldron in which American and Japanese air power consumed each other, with American losses replaceable and Japanese losses increasingly difficult to absorb. Pilot fatigue became a factor for both sides, with combat pilots flying multiple missions per day and accumulating hours of stress that deteriorated judgment and increased accident rates. The air campaign above Guadalcanal was thus a slow burn, not a dramatic finale, but a grinding process of attrition in which American staying power and industrial resources gradually overwhelmed Japanese capability. Weather played an unexpected role in the air campaign above Guadalcanal, with tropical thunderstorms and squalls that rolled across the island and surrounding waters providing natural cover for both Japanese and American aircraft. Pilots on both sides learned to use weather as a tactical asset, diving into clouds to break off engagements that were going badly, or using weather to mask their approach to targets. The unpredictability of weather added another layer of uncertainty to an already unpredictable environment, and pilots needed to develop judgment that balanced aggression with caution. Japanese aircraft sometimes disappeared into weather and failed to return, not because they were shot down, but because they became disoriented and ran out of fuel, unable to locate their home bases in the poor visibility. American pilots faced the same risks, though they had the advantage of operating from known bases on an island rather than from distant bases that required precise navigation over open water. The weather of the Solomon Islands, which was often marginal and sometimes dangerous, thus became another adversary that both sides had to contend with, alongside the human enemy that opposed them. The arrival of additional aircraft types added complexity and capability to the American air defense system at Henderson Field as the campaign developed. Army Air Force's P-39 fighters and later other models arrived to supplement Marine Wildcats, adding different performance characteristics and tactical options to the inventory of American air power. Dive bombers also arrived, allowing American pilots to deliver concentrated firepower against Japanese ships and ground positions with the kind of accuracy that level bombing could never achieve. Torpedo bombers, slower and more vulnerable than fighters, required fighter escort to accomplish their missions, but added a new dimension to American offensive capability. The Japanese Navy sent aircraft designed specifically to counter American fighters, such as the Nakajima Ki-44, but these arrived in limited numbers and often were not ideally suited to the conditions and tactical environment above Guadalcanal. American pilots gradually became comfortable with the different aircraft in their inventory and learned to coordinate them in formations that allowed different aircraft types to support each other and to provide complementary capabilities. The airfield thus became a base not just for fighters, but for a comprehensive air force that could conduct multiple types of missions with increasing sophistication. The human cost of air superiority was measured in pilots and aircraft destroyed, and in the cumulative trauma of men who survived but carried psychological and physical scars for the rest of their lives. American pilots who were shot down over the island had some chance of being rescued by ground forces or retrieved by patrol boats or submarines, but pilots shot down over water often faced the choice between ditching their aircraft near a rescue ship or parachuting and hoping rescue would come before Japanese aircraft found them. Japanese pilots shot down far from their bases often were lost. The distances were too great to swim, and rescue from the water was less organized and less likely than it was for American pilots operating from land bases. The air battles above Guadalcanal, thus, were not merely tactical struggles, but battles for survival and dominance, in which the side that could sustain losses and continue flying had the ultimate advantage. American pilots who returned alive but wounded often flew again within days or weeks, patched up, and returned to flying by necessity. Japanese pilots who survived wounds were more likely to be rotated home, a luxury that was initially possible for Japan, but became increasingly rare as the war progressed and manpower shortages became acute. The transformation of air superiority from Japanese to American above Guadalcanal was not sudden, but a gradual process that unfolded across weeks and months as aircraft arrived, pilots flew missions, and the balance of capability and numbers shifted imperceptibly from day to day. By the beginning of September, the shift was obvious to any observer. American pilots had begun flying offensive sweeps into areas where Japanese aircraft had previously operated unchallenged, and Japanese air attacks on American positions on the island had become less frequent and less coordinated. By the middle of September, American air dominance above Guadalcanal was near total during daylight hours, though Japanese aircraft continued to arrive at night or in brief raids that tried to exploit momentary gaps in American fighter coverage. The recognition of air superiority was as much psychological as military. Marines on the ground looked up at the sky with confidence rather than dread, and pilots at Henderson Field briefed each other on tactics and objectives rather than discussing how to survive the next attack. The airfield that had been a desperate objective in August had become by September the anchor of American power on Guadalcanal, and the foundation upon which victory would eventually be built. The skies above the island had been contested and then claimed, and that claim, once established, would never be relinquished. The first week of August unfolds with a creeping realization among the Marines ashore. The Navy cannot always be there. Above Guadalcanal, American aircraft now operate from Henderson Field, flown by pilots who understand that every mission might be their last. Below the waterline, in the waters surrounding the island, a different kind of battle is taking shape, one fought in darkness, in the confusion of close-quarters combat between ships, where the outcome would determine whether the beachhead could hold. The Japanese, accepting that their ground forces on Guadalcanal have been caught unprepared, shift their strategy toward what they do best: swift, aggressive naval action conducted under cover of night. They call it the Rat Run. The Americans, respecting both the tactic and the danger it represents, adopt their own term, the Tokyo Express. This is not a grand fleet battle fought in daylight with organized formations and clear lines of sight. This is something far more desperate and far more intimate, a series of nocturnal encounters where visibility measures only hundreds of meters, where ships collide in the darkness, where sailors die without ever seeing the men who kill them. The Japanese Navy, despite suffering losses at the Coral Sea and Midway earlier in the year, remains a formidable force in the waters around Guadalcanal. The High Command in Tokyo understands that the American presence on the island threatens the entire Japanese defensive perimeter in the Solomon Islands and beyond. If Guadalcanal cannot be retaken, then it must at least be reinforced and resupplied, kept viable as a forward position from which Japanese forces can eventually counterattack. The solution, born from necessity and from the particular strengths of the Japanese Navy, involves fast warships running supplies and troops down the coast at night, reaching Guadalcanal under darkness, offloading their cargo and reinforcements, and withdrawing before dawn brings with it the danger of air attack. This tactic places enormous demands on the destroyers and cruisers assigned to carry out the mission. They must maintain high speed to compress their window of vulnerability, yet they must be combat-capable enough to fight their way through if they encounter American naval opposition. Speed and firepower become the currency of these midnight engagements, and the Japanese Navy has both in abundance. The night of August 12th arrives moonless and dark, the sky obscured by clouds and rain squalls that sweep across the waters west of Guadalcanal. A Japanese naval force has been dispatched from bases in the northern Solomon Islands specifically to deliver reinforcements and supplies to the beleaguered garrison on Guadalcanal. The Japanese surface force consists of the cruiser Tenaru and 4 destroyers, fast ships that have seen combat before and whose captains and crews understand the risks they face. They move south in the darkness, their engines driving them toward Guadalcanal at a speed that will bring them to the offloading zone around midnight. Unknown to these Japanese sailors, American naval commanders have been tracking their movement through reports and intelligence, and American ships have been positioned to intercept them. The American force, commanded by a captain who has only hours to position his ships for a night engagement, consists of destroyers and cruisers of their own. These two forces are about to collide in the darkness, in a battle that neither side will fully understand while it is happening. The chaos begins near Savo Island, a small landmass that sits between the waters where the Japanese and Americans will meet. Japanese lookouts, straining to see through the darkness and rain, spot American ships and raise an alarm. The Japanese force, trained in night combat and confident in the superiority of their torpedo armaments, begins to maneuver for attack. The Americans, caught somewhat unprepared despite their intelligence warnings, scramble to form a defensive line and launch their own attacks. What follows is not the ordered, distant gunnery duel of a daytime naval battle. Instead, it becomes a melange of converging ships, of searchlights stabbing through the darkness, of gunfire that lights up the sky, of explosions that illuminate individual moments of violence in searing detail. Ships cross each other's paths at ranges that would be considered impossibly close in any other context. Sailors aboard the American vessels hear the scream of incoming shells and feel the concussive force of nearby impacts. Japanese torpedoes, moving through the water at speeds that allow no time for evasion, find their marks on American hulls. Ships that have survived months of war are crippled or destroyed in seconds. Men who have served together for years die together in the darkness, their final moments spent drowning or burning or crushed beneath falling metal. The American cruiser Astoria takes a series of hits that ravage her hull and kill scores of her crew. The destroyer Quincy, caught in the crossfire and unable to escape the superior gunfire concentration brought to bear upon her, sustains repeated impacts and begins to sink. her crew fighting fires and moving wounded men toward the rails as the ship settles into the warm water. The destroyer Vincennes, maneuvering desperately to avoid torpedoes, takes multiple hits and catches fire, the flames spreading rapidly through her superstructure. These three American ships, a cruiser and two destroyers, will be lost or rendered non-operational by the time the engagement ends. Hundreds of American sailors, men who came ashore for the Guadalcanal campaign, men who expected to fight and perhaps die on the island itself, instead lose their lives in the chaos of a night engagement they barely understand. The Japanese, by contrast, suffer lesser damage. The cruiser Tenaru takes hits, but remains combat effective. The destroyers sustain some damage, but none is sunk. In this one engagement, fought in darkness and confusion, the Japanese Navy wins a tactical victory over the American surface fleet. Yet even in victory, the Japanese achievement is incomplete. The offloading of supplies and reinforcements cannot proceed as planned because American ships remain on the scene, and there is no guarantee of continued Japanese naval superiority should the engagement restart as dawn approaches. The Japanese commander, understanding that his force has won the battle, but faces the prospect of being caught in daylight waters where American aircraft will hunt him mercilessly, makes the decision to withdraw. The Tokyo Express completes only part of its mission. Some troops and supplies do reach Guadalcanal, but not the full complement intended. The reinforcement that the Japanese command hoped would strengthen their garrison is reduced by the exigencies of combat. The Japanese Navy, despite its tactical victory, has failed to achieve its strategic objective. American losses, though real and painful, have not deterred American commitment to holding the island. Instead, the losses strengthen the resolve of American commanders to ensure that such naval defeats do not happen again. The Marines on Guadalcanal learn of the night battle from radio reports and from the realization that no fresh supplies arrive to supplement their dwindling rations. The knowledge that the Navy has suffered defeat, that American ships have been sunk, that American sailors have died in the waters offshore, settles over the island like a weight. The Marines have been isolated from the beginning, but this isolation now gains a new dimension. The Navy, which was supposed to provide protection and supply, has been bloodied. The concept that American warships could be defeated by Japanese warships in a night engagement, a concept that many Marines had not fully considered, now becomes real and personal. The veterans among them understand the implication. If the Navy cannot protect the approaches to Guadalcanal, if the Navy cannot guarantee supply runs, then the Marines must be prepared to hold the island with whatever resources they currently possess. The phrase Tokyo Express becomes not a tactical curiosity, but a genuine threat, representing regular Japanese runs that might slip past American naval defenses and bring reinforcements to the Japanese garrisons. The Marines begin to hoard ammunition and ration food more carefully. They begin to understand that the campaign on Guadalcanal is not going to be a matter of days or even a few weeks. It is going to be an extended struggle in which holding the island means holding it against an enemy that retains the capacity to resupply and reinforce through the sea. The Japanese, despite their naval victory, face their own set of mounting problems. The Tokyo Express runs will continue, but they will always be contested. The Marines and Army aircraft, operating from Henderson Field, now number in the dozens and are becoming more capable by the day. Every run down the coast risks not just naval combat but air attack in daylight. The Japanese logistics network, already strained by the vast distances involved in supplying distant garrisons, is stretched to the breaking point by the commitment to reinforce Guadalcanal. Ships are sunk faster than they can be replaced. Supplies that reach the island are often insufficient to sustain the large garrisons that Japanese commanders have placed there. The tactical victory of August 12th will prove to be one of the final occasions when the Japanese Navy achieves a clear advantage in the waters around Guadalcanal. After this night, the balance begins to shift, not because the Japanese Navy loses its combat prowess, but because the sheer weight of American industrial capacity and replacement capability begins to overwhelm Japanese ability to sustain their forces. Ships that are sunk can be built anew in American shipyards by the hundreds. Sailors who are lost are replaced by training programs that, though strained, continue to produce replacements. The Japanese Navy has no such margin of reserves. The significance of August 12th lies not in the outcome of the individual battle, but in what it represents in the broader campaign. This night engagement marks the last clear Japanese naval victory on Guadalcanal. After this date, while Japanese naval forces will continue to contest American control of the waters and will continue to attempt supply runs, they will do so increasingly against deteriorating odds. The Tokyo Express will run again and again, but each run will be harder fought, more costly, and less productive. American naval tactics will improve as they learn from their mistakes. American coordination between air and naval forces will tighten. American naval gunfire support for the Marines will become more consistent and more effective. The Marines on the island, despite their isolation and despite their losses, will increasingly understand that their Navy is learning the lessons of Guadalcanal, and that American naval capabilities, though bloody and costly to acquire, are beginning to turn the tide of the naval battle. The night battle of August 12th thus represents a threshold moment, the last time the Japanese Navy will achieve a tactical victory in these waters, and the moment after which the strategic momentum begins, however slowly and however imperceptibly to those living through it, to shift toward the Americans. The Marines who live through these early days of the campaign witness the night sky light up with gunfire and explosions as the battle unfolds offshore. They see columns of smoke rising above the horizon at dawn, marking the location where American ships have been damaged or sunk. They know, without being told in any official capacity, that American sailors have died for them, that the Navy has paid in blood for its attempt to protect their beachhead. This knowledge creates a bond between the Marines and the Navy that transcends the usual rivalries between different military services. The Marines also know that despite the naval defeat, the island remains in their hands. Henderson Field is still operational. The perimeter still holds. Japanese counterattacks during the night have been repulsed. The question now is not whether the Marines can land or whether they can hold the beaches. The question is whether they can endure. The isolation grows deeper. The Tokyo Express will attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal again and again, and while some missions will succeed, the overall flow of supplies and reinforcements to the Japanese garrison will never reach the levels that Japanese commanders desire. The Marines, conversely, will be reinforced incrementally, their supplies supplemented episodically, their numbers increased as shipping becomes available. The mathematical certainty of attrition begins to favor the Americans. In the days following the night battle, a new rhythm establishes itself on Guadalcanal. Japanese aircraft attack during daylight hours, and American fighters rise to meet them. Japanese forces probe the marine perimeter nightly, and Marines respond with small arms fire and artillery. Japanese supply runs attempt to reach the island under cover of darkness, and American naval forces intercept them when possible. The Marines endure, conscious that their position, though far from secure, is becoming progressively less precarious. Equipment arrives slowly, but arrives nonetheless. Reinforcements come in small groups, but they come. The disease that has felled so many men continues to ravage the garrison, but medical supplies become more available. The psychological toll of isolation remains severe, but the knowledge that the Navy is fighting for them, that the Navy is learning and adapting despite its losses, provides a strange comfort. The night battle of August 12th marks the moment when Guadalcanal transitions from an operation of uncertain outcome to one in which the trend, visible only to those who study the mathematics of attrition and supply, has begun to favor the Americans. The Marines do not know this with certainty. They only know that the Navy lost, that they must hold, and that the long fight is far from over. The calendar turned toward September, and with it came a shift in the nature of the struggle on Guadalcanal. The battles that had raged in August, the furious clashes at the Tenaru, the desperate stands against probing Japanese attacks, these had given way to something quieter and in many ways far more corrosive. The enemy no longer wore a uniform or carried a rifle. It lived in the damp earth beneath the Marines' feet, floated in the water they drank, hummed through the humid air they breathed with every labored inhalation. By early September, the supply ships that had brought thousands of men to the island weeks before had not returned. The Navy, battered by losses in the narrow waters off Guadalcanal and unable to guarantee safe passage, had withdrawn to bases further south. In their wake, they left behind a force of tired men who began to understand, with growing clarity, that they were truly isolated. The airfield, now named Henderson Field in honor of a fallen pilot, had become not just a military objective, but the thread on which their survival hung. Yet survival itself was becoming increasingly difficult. The mathematics of supply were unforgiving. Nearly 20,000 Marines occupied a perimeter that grew tighter with each passing day, and that perimeter generated hunger. The rations that had seemed adequate in July, when resupply was expected within weeks, became insufficient as August bled into September. The official Marine ration allowance provided roughly 3,700 calories per day, calculated for men at rest in temperate climates. The men of Guadalcanal were neither at rest nor in temperate conditions. They worked in heat that often exceeded 95 degrees, dug trenches and built fortifications, patrolled jungle trails, and fought repeated skirmishes against an enemy that refused to accept defeat. Their caloric expenditure climbed toward 5,000, then 6,000 calories daily, while the food that arrived came in irregular shipments aboard destroyers running fast through the night to avoid air attack. The ships themselves were targets, and each voyage became a gamble. Some nights, destroyers arrived. Some nights, they did not. When they did arrive, the cargo they brought was never quite enough, never quite what was needed most urgently. The men grew thin with a rapidity that shocked even the officers who had expected hardship. Within 6 weeks of the landing, photographs taken by official combat correspondents showed faces transformed by deprivation. Cheeks hollowed, eyes sank deeper into their sockets, ribs became visible through shirt fabric, and uniforms that had fit snugly in August hung loose by September, the fabric gathering at shoulders and hips. The human body, driven by work and fear and the constant low-grade anxiety of combat in an alien environment, consumed its own reserves. The rations themselves became monotonous to the point of psychological torment. Corned beef, appearing in 3 different preparations but tasting identical in each iteration. Hard biscuits that could break a tooth if not carefully softened in precious water. Powdered eggs that, when mixed with contaminated water, often produced nausea rather than sustenance. Coffee, at least, was reliable, and the men learned to treasure it above nearly all other things. A hot cup of coffee in the morning became a ritual that anchored sanity in an insane situation. The knowledge that coffee might not appear tomorrow only increased its value. Water became another point of acute anxiety. The island received abundant rainfall, yet the freshwater sources available within the perimeter were limited and increasingly contaminated. Japanese positions still held water points outside the marine lines, and the streams that flowed through the perimeter often received Japanese artillery fire, which contaminated them with bacteria and debris. The Marines rationed water consumption, which meant drinking less than their bodies required in the tropical heat. Dehydration set in gradually, weakening men's ability to resist the diseases that waited in the island's environment with patient malevolence. The choice became a terrible arithmetic: drink contaminated water and risk dysentery and typhoid, or remain thirsty and risk heat stroke and kidney failure. Many chose the contaminated water. Others tried to boil whatever they could, rationing fuel that was itself in desperately short supply. The irony was bitter and inescapable. They stood surrounded by salt water and tropical rainfall, yet they were thirsty. But hunger and thirst, severe as they were, became secondary concerns as September advanced. The real catastrophe unfolded in the body's defenses against the island itself. Malaria arrived first, carried by mosquitoes that emerged from swamps and stagnant water in the evening darkness. The disease was not swift. It was methodical and relentless. Men would feel it building over days, a growing sense of exhaustion, a heaviness in the limbs that sleep did not cure, a fever that climbed in the afternoon and fell again as night deepened. Some of the Marines recognized the symptoms from accounts they had read or heard about. Others simply believed they were weak or losing their nerve. By mid-September, malaria cases numbered in the hundreds. By late September, they numbered in the thousands. At peak periods, more than 1 in 3 men in the marine perimeter suffered from active malaria. Though not all cases were confirmed, many men simply felt too sick to continue, but tried to soldier on, husbanding their strength and hoping the fever would pass. It never simply passed. It came and went, returned and faded again, wearing the body down by increments. Other diseases followed malaria's example, as though they were following a prepared schedule. Dengue fever arrived, causing joint pain so severe that men could barely move. Dysentery spread through the crowded camps, transmitted by the contaminated water and food, leaving men weakened by constant diarrhea and dehydration. Fungal infections bloomed on skin constantly exposed to moisture and heat. Jungle rot, the men called it, a fungus that turned healthy skin into something raw and weeping. Infection followed on infection, as these fungal wounds became entry points for bacterial colonization. Wounds from combat, no matter how small, refused to heal properly in the tropical environment and quickly became infected. The medical supplies available to the few doctors and corpsmen on Guadalcanal ran low as the weeks passed. Quinine, essential for treating malaria, became rationed. Sulfanilamide, the miracle drug used to prevent infections, was carefully husbanded and reserved for the most severe cases. Men with minor wounds that would have been considered routine in other theaters faced real risk of infection progressing to blood poisoning and amputation or death. The Japanese forces across the island faced nearly identical hardships. Their supply situation, dependent on the nighttime destroyer runs that the Americans called the Tokyo Express, was no better than that of the Marines, and in some respects worse. Japanese soldiers endured the same heat, the same diseases, the same relentless pressure of isolation. Some Japanese garrisons, particularly those cut off from the nighttime supply runs or bypassed as American forces expanded their perimeter, faced conditions that approached starvation. Japanese records from this period, preserved after the war, detail rationing that fell well below minimal nutritional requirements. Japanese officers rationed their own portions equally with enlisted men, a practice that reflected Bushido principles but did nothing to improve the fundamental mathematics of insufficient food for thousands of mouths. Japanese soldiers, like American Marines, began to grow thin and disease-ridden. Yet this equality of misery did nothing to ease the fighting. If anything, it intensified the desperation on both sides, as commanders sought to resolve the campaign before starvation made further combat impossible. The psychological toll of these mounting hardships proved as debilitating as the physical effects. Men who had arrived on Guadalcanal confident and well-trained, eager to engage a historic enemy, found themselves weakening not from enemy action, but from the island itself. The frustration was corrosive. They had defeated the Japanese at the Tenaru, sent them fleeing into the jungle with enormous casualties. Yet here they remained, weeks later, still isolated, still hungry, still fighting. The officers tried to maintain morale through official channels. Medals were awarded for bravery. Letters from home were distributed when they arrived. Religious services were conducted in the evenings. But the men felt the wear accumulating in their bodies and could not be convinced that it was temporary. Rumor ran through the perimeter constantly. The Navy had abandoned them. Resupply would never come. They would die on this island. They would never see home. They would be forgotten within a month of their deaths. Some men fell into a kind of apathy, going through the motions of combat and duty with diminished enthusiasm. Others grew irritable, quick to anger at trivial frustrations. Discipline remained generally solid. These were trained Marines after all. And desertion was rare, but the quality of that discipline changed from motivated competence to grim endurance. The constant awareness of isolation deepened the psychological pressure. Messages from the outside world arrived sporadically via radio, bringing news of the wider war. The Soviet Union was still fighting in Europe, holding against Nazi Germany. The United States was gearing up for massive production in factories far away. But these distant developments felt irrelevant to men trapped on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers and dependent on supply lines that seemed increasingly tenuous. The night sounds of the jungle became oppressive, animal calls that the men could not identify, the rustle of movement in darkness that might be Japanese patrols or might be rats the size of cats. Sleep became difficult and never quite restorative. Men would lie in their foxholes or shelters, listening to the sounds of the island, feeling the weight of tropical humidity, thinking about home. Letters from wives and sweethearts, when they arrived, only intensified the sense of separation. A man would read a familiar handwriting, hear his loved one's voice in his mind, and then fold the letter away and climb back into the foxhole, acutely aware that he might never see that person again. The leadership at every level, company commanders, battalion officers, the divisional staff, faced the reality that their men were deteriorating, and that this deterioration threatened military capability as much as Japanese bullets might. Officers began quietly removing men too sick to continue from combat roles, assigning them to supply, communications, or engineer duties where they could contribute without placing others at risk. But there were never enough healthier men to replace those removed, and the lines grew thinner. The Army's official medical records would eventually show that by early October, disease cases outnumbered combat casualties in the ratio of approximately 3-1. For every man wounded by Japanese weapons, 3 more men were incapacitated by malaria or dysentery, or some combination of tropical illness. The implications were staggering. The Japanese were not simply fighting the Marines. They were fighting the island itself, and the island was doing their work for them far more efficiently than rifle fire or artillery ever could. Yet the front lines did not collapse, and the perimeter held. The Marines endured, not through superhuman strength, but through the simple refusal to surrender, through the discipline instilled in training, through the knowledge that accepting defeat meant disaster not just for themselves, but for the Navy and Army units that depended on them holding Guadalcanal. The supply situation began to improve gradually in late September, though improvement was relative and came too late for men who had already contracted serious diseases or been permanently weakened by months of deprivation. Transport ships, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, began making runs with greater frequency and in larger numbers. The risks remained enormous. Japanese aircraft still attacked from bases in the northern Solomon Islands, and Japanese naval forces still prowled the waters, but American naval losses had cost the Japanese dearly, and their ability to contest control of the sea was degrading. With improved supply came more ammunition for the airfield's defenders. American aircraft, now fully operational from Henderson Field, could challenge Japanese air superiority more effectively. The ratio began to shift, slowly at first, then with accelerating momentum, but the human cost of those earlier weeks of deprivation never truly healed. Men who recovered from malaria carried a weakness that never entirely faded. Men who had lost significant weight recovered their body mass, but the psychological scars of isolation and fear remained. They had tasted what it meant to be truly alone, far from home, fighting an enemy that would not break, on an island that actively worked against human survival. That knowledge changed them, marked them in ways that would persist for the rest of their lives. As September turned toward October, the campaign on Guadalcanal entered a new phase. The Marines were no longer a striking force operating in enemy territory. They had become something closer to an occupying force, defending a position that Japanese military command was determined to retake. The next battles would be fought by men who had been reduced by hunger and disease to something less than their full strength, yet who would be required to hold their lines against repeated coordinated Japanese assaults. The island itself, with its stifling heat and relentless biological warfare against human health, had become the dominant world of the campaign. The enemy could be fought with weapons and tactics. The island required something else entirely, a kind of passive resistance, an endurance that asked nothing of courage or skill beyond the willingness to remain standing when standing became the hardest thing in the world. As summer gave way to autumn, and the calendar turned from August into September, the campaign on Guadalcanal entered a new and more savage phase. The Japanese military, stunned by their failure to crush the American beachhead in the weeks following the invasion, began to reassess their strategy with growing urgency. In Tokyo and at regional headquarters in Rabaul, senior commanders faced a bitter truth. The airlift and small reinforcement runs had not been enough to dislodge the Marines. Now, as American strength on the island grew visibly with each passing week, the window of opportunity to retake Guadalcanal was closing. Japanese planners made a decision born of desperation and overconfidence in equal measure. They would commit much larger forces in coordinated, multi-pronged attacks designed to smash through the American defenses at chosen points. These would not be the small probing attacks and night raids of August, but concentrated offensives involving thousands of soldiers, with the expectation that mass and aggressive spirit would overcome American firepower and entrenchment. The Marines, meanwhile, had been gathering their own strength. Though reinforcements came slowly and often in driblets rather than full battalions, each new arrival strengthened the perimeter around Henderson Field. By early September, Additional marine companies and some army artillery units had landed, increasing the garrison from the initial 20,000 to nearly 25,000 combat troops. The Americans had also used these precious weeks to improve their defensive works. Barbed wire crisscrossed the approaches to the perimeter. Sandbags protected gun emplacements. Fields of fire were carefully calculated so that machine gun and rifle fire could cover every conceivable avenue of approach. The airfield itself was now capable of handling regular flights of American fighters, and the presence of these aircraft overhead during daylight hours began to shift the balance of power in ways that Japanese planners had not fully anticipated. Artillery pieces, both light field guns and heavier howitzers, were emplaced in mutually supporting positions. To a visitor from another theater of war, the American defensive perimeter might have seemed modest. To the Marines who held it, it represented their only barrier against annihilation in a hostile land far from home. September brought the first of the major Japanese offensives. Japanese commanders had decided to mass their available forces for a breakthrough assault aimed at the western and southern sectors of the perimeter, where intelligence suggested the American defenses were less robust than in other areas. On the night of September 12th, Japanese forces totaling roughly 4,000 soldiers moved into position for what would be called the Battle of Bloody Ridge by the Americans. The Japanese soldiers, many of them veterans of operations in China and Southeast Asia, moved through the jungle under cover of darkness with grim determination. They had been told that the Americans were weakened, demoralized, and vulnerable to a decisive blow delivered with speed and ferocity. Some officers and men believed this. Others harbored doubts but kept them to themselves. The night was humid and thick with tropical growth. Visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The jungle itself became a combatant in the battle, as thorns and vines tore at uniforms and exposed skin, and the disorientation of night fighting in such terrain affected both sides. The Marines defending the ridge positions, many of them already veterans of 6 weeks of continuous combat, waited in their prepared positions. They had laid out interlocking fields of fire and established communication with their supporting artillery through field telephones and runners. As the Japanese emerged from the jungle in the pre-dawn hours of September 13th, they were met with a wall of machine gun fire and exploding artillery rounds that tore through the packed ranks of attacking soldiers. The Japanese, trained to assault quickly and aggressively, charged forward despite devastating casualties. For several hours, the battle raged with incredible intensity. Japanese soldiers who made it to the American lines engaged Marines in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and swords. American Marines, many of them young men in their late teens and early 20s, defended their positions with the determination of soldiers who understood that defeat meant death. The noise was overwhelming. The constant chatter of machine guns, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the roar of artillery, and the screams of wounded men. The darkness was intermittently lit by muzzle flashes and illumination rounds fired by American artillery, creating a scene of almost hellish chaos. By daybreak on September 13th, the Japanese assault had been repulsed with enormous casualties. Japanese commanders, observing the failure of their frontal assault, made the fateful decision to renew the attack. Throughout that day and into the following night, fresh Japanese forces were committed to the assault. American artillery, now continuously supplied with ammunition from newly arrived cargo ships,